America, a nation that calls itself the symbol of freedom, democracy, and justice. But beneath that glorious image lie secrets that textbooks never teach you. Today, we won't be talking about heroes. We'll flip history on its head and look straight into the dark side of the most powerful people on the planet. One president ordered the forced removal of tens of thousands of people from their ancestral lands, leaving them to die of cold along the way. And his face is still sitting on the $20 bill in your wallet right now. Another president screened a film glorifying the Ku Klux Klan inside the White House itself, and was later awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. One man lied to an entire nation to launch a war that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. And one man, for the first time in 250 years of history, refused to peacefully transfer power. 10 names, 10 dark legacies, 10 truths that America has never been able to fully face. Are you ready? Before we begin, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear might change the way you see history forever. And if you believe the truth should never be buried, share this video so more people can see what's really behind the headlines. Chapter 1. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President. If you pull a $20 bill out of your wallet, you'll see the face of a man with silver hair swept straight up and a gaze full of authority. That is Andrew Jackson. Americans put him on their currency because they consider him a national hero, a man of humble origins who rose to the heights of power. But if you ask the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, or Seminole people, they would give you a very different answer. To them, the face on the $20 bill is the face of the man who destroyed their nations. Andrew Jackson was born in 1767 on the border between North and South Carolina into a poor Irish immigrant family. His father died before he was born, and the American Revolution claimed his only brother when Jackson was just 14. He himself was captured by British soldiers, and when he refused to polish the boots of a British officer, the officer slashed his face with a sword, a scar he carried for the rest of his life. That painful childhood forged a man so hardened he bordered on ruthless. A man who never knew fear and never knew forgiveness. Before becoming president, Jackson had already made a name for himself as an unrelenting general in the wars against Native Americans and in the War of 1812 against the British. He participated in at least 13 duels over the course of his life, and in one in 1806, he shot and killed a man named Charles Dickinson simply because Dickinson had insulted his wife. Dickinson's bullet lodged in Jackson's chest near his heart, but Jackson didn't fall. He stood his ground and shot his opponent dead. That bullet stayed inside him for the rest of his life. That was Andrew Jackson, tough to the point of obsession and cold to the point of cruelty. When Jackson won the presidency in 1828, he was seen as a symbol of the new democracy. For the first time in American history, a man who did not come from the aristocracy of Virginia or Massachusetts had climbed to the highest office. Ordinary citizens flooded Washington to celebrate in such numbers that the inauguration nearly descended into a riot. They surged into the White House, climbed on the furniture, smashed china, spilled drinks on the carpets. And Jackson himself had to slip out the back door to escape his own party. But the so-called democracy Jackson represented was only for white people. While he championed equality for the white working class, he simultaneously owned more than 150 enslaved people at his Hermitage plantation in Tennessee. He bought and sold them like commodities, placed advertisements offering cash rewards for escaped enslaved people, and felt no apparent conflict between what he preached and what he practiced. To Jackson, freedom was something reserved only for those he deemed worthy of it, and black people were clearly not on that list. But the greatest crime Jackson left to history was not slavery. It was what he signed on May 28, 1830, a document with a deceptively ordinary name: the Indian Removal Act. To understand why this act is considered one of the most brutal actions ever taken by a Western democratic government against its own people, we need to understand the context. In the early 19th century, the major native tribes of the American Southeast, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole, had lived on that land for thousands of years. The Cherokee had done everything white Americans asked of them to be considered civilized. They built schools. They published a newspaper in their own language. They drafted a constitution modeled on the American one. Many wore European clothing and converted to Christianity. They believed that if they assimilated deeply enough into American society, they would be left in peace. They were completely wrong. When gold was discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia in 1828, every promise and every treaty became worthless overnight. White settlers wanted that land, and Andrew Jackson was willing to take it for them. The Indian Removal Act gave the president the authority to negotiate with the tribes to exchange their lands east of the Mississippi for distant territory to the west, what is today the state of Oklahoma. The word negotiate sounds civilized, but in practice, it was a threat dressed up in diplomatic language. What is even more remarkable is that the Cherokee did not submit in silence. They took their case to the United States Supreme Court, and in 1832, in Worcester versus Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the state of Georgia had no right to impose its laws on Cherokee lands, and that the federal government was bound by treaty to protect them. This was a ruling from the highest court in the land. A true rule of law state would have complied. Andrew Jackson did not comply. He is widely credited with saying, though historians still debate the exact wording, something to the effect of, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Whether or not those were his precise words, his actions left no room for doubt. He ignored the Supreme Court's ruling and pressed forward with the forced removal of Native people. This stands as one of the rare moments in American history when a president openly defied and nullified the power of the judiciary, shattering the principle of separation of powers that the Constitution itself enshrined. The consequence of all this was what the Cherokee called Nuna Dal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. Americans later named it the Trail of Tears. From 1836 to 1839, the U.S. Army used rifles and bayonets to force tens of thousands of Cherokee into temporary holding camps while they awaited deportation. Conditions in those camps were so horrific that disease broke out even before the journey began. Then the people were forced to walk, or travel by the most primitive means, thousands of miles westward, through brutal winters with insufficient food, inadequate clothing, and no medicine. The elderly died of cold. Children died of hunger. The young died of disease. Estimates suggest that between 4,000 and 8,000 Cherokee died during the removal, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire Cherokee population at the time. And the Cherokee were not the only nation to suffer this fate. The Choctaw were removed first. The Creek were shackled in chains as they were marched away. The Chickasaw lost their lands. The Seminole in Florida fought for years before most were defeated and forcibly deported. In total, somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 Native people were forcibly displaced under Jackson and his successors' policies. All of this happened in a country that had once written, "All men are created equal." Beyond his policies toward Native peoples, Andrew Jackson left behind an equally controversial economic legacy. He harbored an almost fanatical hatred of banks, particularly the Second Bank of the United States, the country's central financial institution at the time. He saw it as a tool of the wealthy to oppress ordinary people, and in 1833, he withdrew all federal deposits from the bank and scattered them among smaller state banks, which he selected based entirely on political loyalty rather than financial competence. The consequences were not long in coming. After Jackson left office in 1837, the American economy collapsed in what became known as the Panic of 1837, one of the worst economic depressions of the 19th century. The small banks Jackson had favored failed in waves, thousands of businesses went bankrupt, and unemployment spread across the country. Many economic historians draw a direct line between Jackson's dismantling of the central bank and that financial catastrophe.
Andrew Jackson left the White House in 1837 with high approval ratings, widely celebrated by ordinary white Americans as one of the greatest presidents who had ever lived. He died in 1845 at his Hermitage plantation, still surrounded by the enslaved people who served him to his final breath. In his will, he freed not a single one of them. For centuries afterward, history treated him kindly. Cities, schools, and statues bore his name, and his face graced the nation's currency. But starting in the late 20th century, a growing number of historians and Native American communities began calling for a more honest reckoning with his legacy. In 2016, the U.S. government announced it would replace Jackson's image with that of Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill, though the decision has been delayed multiple times for political reasons and has still not been carried out. Andrew Jackson was a product of his time, that much is true. But even by the standards of his era, what he did to Native peoples was condemned by many of his contemporaries. The writer Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a letter of protest against the Cherokee removal policy. Many members of Congress voted against the Indian Removal Act. They knew it was wrong. Jackson knew what they thought. He simply didn't care. That may be the most disturbing thing about Andrew Jackson. He was not a man who did evil out of ignorance. He was a man who chose it, with full awareness, with full power, and with complete confidence that history would vindicate him. And for a very long time, history did exactly that. Chapter 2. Richard Nixon, the 37th President, the man who destroyed himself. There is a question historians still debate to this day. Why did Richard Nixon do it? He was one of the most intelligent politicians ever to sit in the Oval Office. He understood the law, he understood politics, and he understood better than anyone that what he was doing was wrong. And yet he did it anyway. That is why the story of Richard Nixon is not simply a story about corruption or abuse of power. It is the story of a man consumed from within by fear and hatred, until there was nothing left to save. Richard Nixon was born in 1913 in Yorba Linda, California, into a poor Quaker family. Unlike many of his predecessors, Nixon did not have a comfortable childhood. His family struggled with debt. 2 of his brothers died of tuberculosis, and Nixon had to turn down a scholarship to Harvard because his family couldn't afford the living expenses. He studied law at a smaller school, became an attorney, and entered politics with the determination of a man who had nothing to lose. But from his very first steps in political life, Nixon demonstrated a willingness to use any tactic available. In the 1950 Senate race, he attacked his opponent Helen Douglas by insinuating she had communist sympathies, a charge with no evidence whatsoever, but devastatingly effective during the tense years of the Cold War. From that point on, people called him Tricky Dick, and that nickname would follow him for the rest of his life. After 2 terms as Eisenhower's vice president, Nixon lost the 1960 presidential election to John F. Kennedy by the narrowest of margins. It was his first defeat, but not his last. In 1962, he lost the California governor's race as well, and in a bitter press conference afterward, he told reporters, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." Most people assumed his political career was finished. They were wrong. In 1968, with America being torn apart by the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and a series of shattering assassinations, Richard Nixon came back and won the presidency. He promised peace. He promised to unite the country. He promised to end the Vietnam War, which was consuming tens of thousands of American lives every year. In reality, even before taking office, Nixon had secretly undermined the Paris peace talks that the Johnson administration was working to advance. He had back-channel contacts reach out to South Vietnam, urging them not to sign any agreement with the Johnson administration, because he would offer better terms once elected. In other words, he prolonged the war for personal political gain while American soldiers were dying every single day. Historian John A. Farrell later uncovered evidence of this in declassified documents, and it is widely regarded as one of the most subtle acts of betrayal in the history of modern American politics. Once in office, Nixon declared he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. That plan turned out to be an escalation of the war in the shadows, not an end to it. In 1969, Nixon ordered the secret bombing of Cambodia, a neutral country that had not declared war on the United States. The operation, known as Operation Menu, with individual campaigns bearing names like breakfast, lunch, and dessert, sounded almost whimsical, but for the people of Cambodia, it was catastrophic. Over 4 years, the U.S. Air Force dropped more bombs on Cambodia than the total dropped on Japan during all of World War II, including both atomic bombs. Estimates suggest between 150,000 and 500,000 Cambodian civilians were killed. What made this especially grave was that Nixon concealed it entirely from Congress and the American public. He falsified military records to hide the airstrikes, creating a parallel reporting system in which pilots were required to log false coordinates. This was not merely an ethical violation, it was a constitutional one, since the power to declare war belongs to Congress, not the president. The indirect consequences proved even more devastating. The chaos unleashed on Cambodia created the conditions for Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge to seize power, leading to the Cambodian genocide of 1975 to 1979, which killed approximately 2 million people, roughly 1/4 of the country's entire population. But it was the Watergate scandal that engraved Nixon's name in history as a permanent indictment. The story began on the night of June 17, 1972, when 5 men were caught breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. They were carrying wiretapping equipment and cameras. At first, it looked like an ordinary burglary. The White House immediately denied any connection. But when 2 young Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, began investigating, they slowly pulled on a thread that led all the way to the highest levels of White House power. The 5 burglars were not ordinary criminals. They had ties to the CIA and to Nixon's committee to re-elect the president. The money used to pay them could be traced directly back to Nixon's campaign fund. At that moment, Nixon was in a position of enormous strength. He had just won a landslide re-election in November 1972, defeating his opponent, George McGovern, by an electoral college margin of 520 to 17, one of the most decisive victories in American history. Had he done nothing further, he might have survived the scandal. Instead, he chose to cover it up, and it was the cover-up that destroyed him politically. The almost unbelievable truth is that Nixon had been secretly recording all conversations in the Oval Office since 1971, a habit he believed would help him preserve historical moments for posterity. When Congress discovered the existence of the taping system and demanded the recordings, everything began to unravel. Nixon refused to hand over the tapes. He fired the special prosecutor investigating Watergate, Archibald Cox, in what the American press dubbed the Saturday Night Massacre, because the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General both refused to carry out the order and resigned one after the other before a third official finally complied. The move so outraged the American public that calls for impeachment flooded Congress. The Supreme Court ultimately issued a unanimous 8-0 ruling that Nixon had to surrender the tapes. And when those recordings were released, they revealed what Americans had both feared and refused to believe. Their president, just 6 days after the Watergate break-in, had sat with his closest aides and discussed using the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation. This was not an impulsive act. It was a deliberate, premeditated obstruction of justice, planned at the very highest level. In other recordings, Nixon used crude, racially charged language and expressed deep contempt for Jewish people, black people, and numerous other groups he viewed as enemies. The image of a commanding, dignified president that he had projected in public shattered completely when people heard what he actually said behind closed doors. What was uncovered during the Watergate investigation did not stop at the break-in itself. It gradually became clear that Watergate was only the visible tip of a vast and submerged iceberg. Nixon had built a political operation that was both corrupt and deeply sinister, one whose full scope even some of his own inner circle did not entirely grasp. He maintained what became known as an enemies list, a document containing hundreds of names, journalists, members of Congress, academics, actors, and other public figures whom Nixon considered threats to himself. For those on the list, he directed the Internal Revenue Service to conduct targeted tax audits designed to cause them financial trouble. He used the FBI to surveil reporters and political opponents. He created a special unit inside the White House, known as the Plumbers, nominally tasked with stopping information leaks, but in practice, conducting espionage and political sabotage operations. It was the Plumbers who carried out the Watergate break-in. It was also the Plumbers who broke into the office of the psychiatrist treating Daniel Ellsberg, the man who had leaked the Pentagon Papers, in search of material to discredit him. When these actions came to light, they revealed that the Nixon administration had transformed the machinery of government into a personal and political instrument serving the president's own interests. Precisely the thing the American Constitution had been designed to prevent. By the summer of 1974, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The House Judiciary Committee voted to pass 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and defiance of congressional subpoenas. Republican leaders, including Nixon's most loyal supporters, came to the White House to inform him that he no longer had enough votes in the Senate to avoid conviction and removal from office. Nixon understood that the game was over. On the evening of August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon appeared on national television to announce his resignation, becoming the only president in American history to leave office in that manner. He admitted no wrongdoing whatsoever in his resignation address. He said he was stepping down because he no longer had sufficient political support to govern effectively, as though the entire affair were merely a question of vote counts, rather than the inevitable consequence of systematic lawbreaking and moral failure. The following morning, Nixon delivered an emotional farewell to the White House staff, then walked to Marine One for the last time. As the helicopter lifted off, he turned and waved, smiling. That was the final image of Nixon at the White House, a smile that, to this day, no one can say with certainty what it was concealing. 1 month after Nixon resigned, his successor, Gerald Ford, granted him a full and unconditional pardon for all offenses against the United States which he has committed or may have committed or taken part in during his presidency. Nixon was not required to acknowledge any specific wrongdoing to receive it. The decision triggered a wave of intense outrage across the country. Ford's approval rating fell 20 points in a matter of days, and many believe the pardon was the decisive reason he lost the 1976 presidential election. The question of whether a secret deal had been struck between Ford and Nixon, an agreement to pardon him in exchange for his resignation, was never definitively answered, but it haunted both men for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, many of Nixon's associates went to prison, including White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, Domestic Affairs Advisor John Ehrlichman, and former Attorney General John Mitchell. More than 70 people were indicted or convicted in cases connected to Watergate. Only Nixon himself never stood trial. Nixon lived for another 20 years after his resignation, dying in 1994. In those years, he wrote memoirs, advised successive presidents on foreign policy, and gradually recovered a measure of rehabilitation in the eyes of some Americans. Many remember him as the statesman who opened relations with China in 1972, a genuinely historic achievement. Others credit him with ending the military draft and establishing the Environmental Protection Agency. But history does not allow a man to curate his own legacy. Alongside those accomplishments, Nixon left behind something far more dangerous and far more lasting. He eroded the American people's trust in their own government in a way the country has never fully recovered from. Before Watergate, most Americans trusted their government. After Watergate, that became the minority view. That is Nixon's true legacy, not the tapes, not the break-in, but the hollow space where trust once lived. In his famous 1977 interview with journalist David Frost, Nixon was asked directly whether a president could do something illegal without it being considered a crime. He replied that when the president does something, that means it is not illegal. That was the answer of the most powerful man in the world when asked whether he stood above the law. And that is why, regardless of his genuine accomplishments, the name Richard Nixon will forever be bound to betrayal, deception, and the price a nation pays when its leader forgets that no one stands higher than the law. Chapter 3. James Buchanan, the 15th President, the man who let America burn. Some people enter history because of the great things they did. Others enter history because of the terrible things they did. And then there is James Buchanan, a man who entered history because of what he failed to do, while the country he governed slid toward one of the worst catastrophes a nation can inflict upon itself. Most Americans today know little about James Buchanan, and that is precisely the reward history reserves for those who leave nothing worth remembering. But look more closely, and Buchanan's story is not the story of a harmless mediocrity. It is the story of a man with the ability, the experience, and the information to prevent disaster, who chose to do nothing. And that choice to do nothing killed hundreds of thousands of people. The first and greatest irony about James Buchanan is that he was arguably the best prepared president in terms of experience of anyone who ever held the office. Born in 1791 in Pennsylvania, he became a successful lawyer before entering politics and climbing the ladder patiently and methodically over 4 decades. He served in the House of Representatives, then the Senate, then as U.S. Ambassador to Russia under President Jackson, then as Secretary of State under President Polk, then as Ambassador to Britain under President Pierce. When he took office in 1857, at the age of 65, he had more than 40 years of government experience behind him, a record few American presidents could match. And that is precisely why what happened over the next 4 years is so painful. Not because Buchanan didn't know, but because he knew perfectly well and chose inaction anyway. Buchanan was the only bachelor ever to serve as president, and throughout his political career, he maintained an unusually close relationship with Senator William Rufus Devane King of Alabama, who later became vice president under President Pierce. The two men lived together for years in Washington, sharing accommodations and appearing together so frequently that contemporary politicians gave them unflattering nicknames. This is a detail modern historians debate at length without reaching definitive conclusions, since the standards and language of the 19th century differ from today's. What matters more historically is that this close bond with a Southern senator profoundly shaped Buchanan's political worldview in ways that dangerously favored the interests of the slaveholding states. To understand why what Buchanan did and failed to do mattered so enormously, we need to understand what America looked like in 1857 when he took office. Slavery had been the deepest fracture in American society since the nation's founding. The Constitution, drafted in 1787, had sidestepped the issue with considerable cleverness, but it could not sidestep it forever. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, a series of political compromises held the country together, most notably the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which drew a geographic line between slave states and free states, and the Compromise of 1850, which attempted to satisfy both sides through a complex set of mutual concessions. But in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, signed by Buchanan's predecessor Franklin Pierce, shattered the Missouri Compromise, allowing residents of new territories to decide the question of slavery for themselves by popular vote. The immediate result was that Kansas became a literal battlefield, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured in to contest the territory by force. The period became known as Bleeding Kansas, and it was a miniature preview of what the entire nation was about to experience. By the time Buchanan took office, two rival governments were operating simultaneously in Kansas. One pro-slavery, one anti-slavery, each claiming legitimacy. This was a constitutional crisis erupting directly before his eyes, and no one understood that more clearly than he did. Just 2 days after Buchanan's inauguration, the Supreme Court handed down its ruling in Dred Scott versus Sanford, one of the most infamous decisions in the history of American jurisprudence. The court, with a pro-Southern majority, ruled that black people, whether enslaved or free, were not American citizens and therefore had no standing to bring suit in court. The court went further, ruling that Congress had no constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in any territory, effectively nullifying all previous compromises and opening the door to the expansion of slavery everywhere. What the public did not know at the time, but historians later discovered through preserved correspondence, was that Buchanan had secretly lobbied the justices to produce a definitive ruling that could settle the slavery question once and for all. He knew the substance of the decision before it was announced, and in his inaugural address, he had referred to a forthcoming ruling, urging the people to accept cheerfully whatever the court decided. A president interfering in a Supreme Court decision before it is handed down is a serious violation of the separation of powers. But to Buchanan, the ends justified the means. He believed that if the court definitively resolved the slavery question in the South's favor, the crisis would end and the country would return to peace. He was entirely wrong. The Dred Scott ruling did not ease tensions. It enraged the North as never before, pushing America faster toward civil war rather than pulling it back. If the Dred Scott affair showed that Buchanan was willing to violate ethical norms to serve his political goals, the story of the Lecompton Constitution showed he was prepared to go even further in defending Southern interests. In 1857, pro-slavery settlers in Kansas convened a constitutional convention in the town of Lecompton and drafted a state constitution that protected the right to own enslaved people. But when they held a ratification vote, they rigged the process. Voters were not permitted to vote against the Constitution outright. They could only choose between the Constitution with slavery or the Constitution without new slavery, meaning existing enslaved people would remain protected under either option. When the majority of Kansas residents refused to participate in such a fraudulent vote, the pro-slavery faction declared the Lecompton Constitution approved regardless. The governor of Kansas at the time, Robert Walker, a man Buchanan himself had appointed, wrote back to Washington reporting that the entire process was fraudulent and did not reflect the genuine will of the Kansas people. Most observers expected that faced with such clear-cut evidence of fraud, Buchanan would reject the Lecompton Constitution. Instead, Buchanan defended it and pushed Congress to admit Kansas to the Union under the Lecompton Constitution. That is, to admit Kansas as a slave state, on the basis of a rigged vote. The move fractured even his own Democratic Party. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, one of the most respected Democratic politicians in the country, publicly broke with Buchanan and called what he was doing a betrayal of the most fundamental democratic principles. Congress ultimately refused to ratify the Lecompton Constitution and required Kansas to hold a fair referendum, in which the people of Kansas rejected it by an overwhelming margin. But the damage had been done. Buchanan had lost the support of a major faction within his own party, had reinforced the North's suspicion that he was an instrument of Southern slaveholders, and had squandered what may have been the last opportunity to resolve the Kansas crisis peacefully and fairly. 1857 brought Buchanan not only political troubles. In the very first year of his term, the country fell into a severe financial crisis, known as the Panic of 1857. As banks failed in waves, the stock market collapsed, and unemployment spread across the northern states. Buchanan's response to the economic crisis reflected exactly how he responded to every problem during his presidency. He did nothing of any consequence. He subscribed to a rigid economic philosophy that the government should not intervene in the economy, and while people lost their jobs and homes, he waited for the market to heal itself. The crisis devastated the industrial North, while the agricultural South, anchored by cotton, was comparatively less affected, which only reinforced the Southern argument that a slave-based economy was more stable than the free labor economy of the North. The reality was that the panic was largely the product of excessive speculation in real estate and railroads, but in the charged political atmosphere of the time, everything was pulled into the debate over slavery. In October 1859, an event occurred that permanently altered the political atmosphere in America and pushed the crisis to a level that no one could contain. John Brown, a fanatical and violent abolitionist, led a group of 21 men in an attack on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with the plan of sparking a slave uprising across the South. The plan failed catastrophically. A force of Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee quickly suppressed the raid, and John Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. But Harper's Ferry left a psychological mark that could not be erased. To Southerners, it was proof that the North was actively seeking to incite slave rebellions and destroy their way of life. To Northerners, John Brown became a martyr for justice, and many viewed him as a hero. These two utterly opposing readings of the same event revealed that the two halves of the country were now living in such different realities that they no longer shared enough common language to speak to one another. Buchanan responded by condemning John Brown, which was reasonable and appropriate, but he did nothing to address the deep fears gripping the South, and nothing to reassure the South that one fanatical individual did not represent federal policy. He chose passive silence while his country stood on the edge of catastrophe. Buchanan chose not to seek a second term, one of the few wise decisions he made, perhaps because he understood he would never win his party's nomination after everything that had happened. The election of 1860 took place in an atmosphere of extreme tension, with 4 candidates from 4 different factions, reflecting the complete collapse of the traditional two-party political system. Abraham Lincoln, of the young Republican Party, won the presidency without carrying a single electoral vote from any Southern state, demonstrating that the country had fractured so completely that a man could become president while half the nation had never had a meaningful chance to vote for or against him. The reaction from the Southern states was immediate. South Carolina declared its secession from the Union in December 1860, before Lincoln had even been inaugurated. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. By February 1861, the Confederate States of America had been formed, with Jefferson Davis as its president. And throughout all of this, from December 1860 to March 1861, James Buchanan was still President of the United States. This is the period for which historians would judge Buchanan most harshly, and for good reason. As the Southern states began to secede, several members of Buchanan's cabinet urged him to act decisively to defend the Union. Some recommended sending troops to reinforce federal forts in the South. Others urged him to declare secession unconstitutional and unlawful. General Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the U.S. Army, recommended deploying forces to secure strategic positions before the Confederacy seized them. Buchanan refused everything. He commissioned a legal analysis of secession and received the conclusion he wanted to hear. The states had no constitutional right to secede, but the federal government also had no constitutional authority to stop them by force. In other words, secession was illegal, but no one could do anything about it. This was a legal argument that fundamentally contradicted itself. But Buchanan embraced it as a lifeline, a justification for doing nothing while maintaining the appearance of principled restraint. Meanwhile, Southern members of his own cabinet were secretly sabotaging the government from within. Secretary of War John B. Floyd of Virginia transferred weapons and ammunition from Northern arsenals to Southern ones before resigning to join the Confederacy. Treasury Secretary Hal Cobb of Georgia deliberately weakened federal finances before he too resigned to join the Confederate cause. Secretary of the Navy Isaac Toucey dispersed the American fleet far from the coastline, leaving the federal government unable to respond quickly should conflict break out. Buchanan knew all of this was happening. He did not act to stop it. He allowed men who were actively preparing for war against the federal government to remain in his cabinet, retain access to classified government information, and continue their work until they chose to resign on their own terms. When Fort Sumter in South Carolina, one of the last remaining federal forts in the South, was placed under Confederate siege and fell critically short of supplies, Buchanan attempted to send an unarmed supply ship, the Star of the West, in January 1861. Confederate forces opened fire on the vessel, and it was forced to turn back. Buchanan took no further action. He simply counted down the days until his term was over. When Abraham Lincoln arrived in Washington to be inaugurated, Buchanan met him and was recorded as saying, "If you are as happy entering the White House as I am leaving it, you are a very happy man indeed." That remark reveals everything one needs to know about James Buchanan, a man relieved to be freed from responsibility, who handed his successor a disintegrating country, a union being torn apart, and a war that Lincoln would have to fight with depleted resources and a military apparatus sabotaged from within. 6 weeks after Lincoln's inauguration, the Civil War began with the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. The war lasted 4 years and killed approximately 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers on both sides, not counting civilians, making it the bloodiest conflict in American history to this day, and the only war ever fought on American soil in the modern era. Buchanan lived 7 more years after leaving the White House, dying in 1868 at his Wheatland estate in Pennsylvania at the age of 77. In those years, he wrote a memoir defending his conduct, arguing that he had done everything possible under difficult circumstances, and that responsibility for the war lay with the extremists on both sides, not with him. He refused to acknowledge a single mistake in any of his decisions. Few people agreed with him. Even during his own lifetime, Buchanan was regarded by many of his contemporaries as either a traitor or a coward. The letters and diaries of people who lived through that period revealed deep contempt for a president who, at the most decisive historical moment his country had ever faced, chose to sit still and wait for someone else to clean up the wreckage that his own passivity had created. In virtually every historical survey of American presidents, James Buchanan ranks at or near the bottom, often competing for the title of worst president with Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor. That verdict reflects a simple but profound truth. In history, those who fail to act at decisive moments sometimes leave consequences more terrible than those who act wrongly. The question historians continue to debate is whether a more decisive and courageous president could have prevented the Civil War. No certain answer is possible, since history offers no controlled experiments. But what is beyond dispute is that what Buchanan did during his 4 years in office made the war more inevitable, not less. He had the power, the authority, and the time to act differently. He chose not to. History does not forgive those who hold power but lack courage. And James Buchanan, the most experienced man ever to enter the White House, a man who watched the fire rising and chose to turn and walk away, will forever stand as the most vivid proof of that. Chapter 4. Andrew Johnson, the 17th President, the man who betrayed the newly freed. Imagine you are an enslaved black person in the American South in April of 1865. Your entire life, and the lives of your parents, your grandparents, and your ancestors across generations, you have been treated as property, not as a human being. You have no name in any legal document, no right to a lawful marriage, no right to learn to read, no right to own anything, and no right to refuse any order from your owner. Then suddenly, after 4 years of the bloodiest war in American history, everything changes. The South has lost, General Lee has surrendered, and President Lincoln has declared that slavery is finished. Freedom is coming, and with it, the promise of a new life. Land, the right to vote, the chance to live as a full human being at last. Then Lincoln is assassinated. And the man who steps up to replace him is Andrew Johnson, a man who, over the next 4 years, will do everything in his power to ensure that freedom remains forever just a word on paper, never a reality in your life. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808 in Raleigh, North Carolina, into a family so poor that he never attended school a single day in his life. His father died young, his mother worked as a laborer to support her children, and Johnson grew up in such poverty that both he and his mother were bound out, essentially sold as indentured servants to a local tailor, as the law of that era permitted for the destitute. He learned the tailor's trade, learned to read and write from his wife later in life, and slowly pulled himself up to become a local politician in Tennessee. Because of that impoverished background, Johnson carried throughout his life a deep and abiding hatred for the Southern aristocracy. The wealthy plantation owners with their grand white houses and hundreds of acres of land. He saw them as class enemies, people who had always looked down on him and those like him. This might suggest that Johnson should have opposed slavery, since slavery was precisely the engine that kept the Southern gentry in power and wealth. But the reality was far more complicated. Johnson hated the Southern aristocracy, and he also hated black people. In his mind, there was no contradiction between the two. He viewed slavery as a system that allowed poor white men like himself to stand at least one rung above someone else in the social order. If enslaved people were freed and given equal rights, the social standing of poor white men would be threatened. That was the simple and brutal logic of a man who had grown up inside a racially stratified society and had never truly escaped its thinking, even as he climbed to the very top of its power structure. Johnson himself was a slaveholder. He was not a large planter like the Southern aristocrats he despised, but he owned at least 8 enslaved people at the time the Civil War broke out. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, a proclamation that technically did not apply to Tennessee, since that state was already under Union military control, Johnson was in no hurry to free the people he enslaved. In 1861, when the Southern states declared secession, Andrew Johnson was a senator from Tennessee and the only Southern senator from a seceding state who remained in the U.S. Senate rather than resigning to join the Confederacy. That act required genuine courage. Many people in Tennessee regarded him as a traitor, and his family received threats, but his motives were not as noble as they might appear. Johnson did not stay because he opposed slavery or believed in racial equality. He stayed because he believed in the Union, and because he hated the Southern aristocracy leading the secession movement more than he hated anything else. Lincoln appointed Johnson military governor of Tennessee during the war, and in 1864, as Lincoln sought re-election, he selected Johnson as his running mate with clear political calculation. A Southern Unionist on the ticket would signal national unity and attract votes from citizens who wanted the war to end quickly. Never in American history has a vice presidential choice carried such catastrophic consequences. At the inauguration ceremony in March 1865, Johnson appeared before the Senate in an obviously intoxicated state. His address was rambling and incoherent, and left those present cringing on his behalf. Lincoln was reported to have leaned over to a nearby official and whispered, "Don't let him speak again." It was a mortifying beginning, and it foreshadowed the 4 years to come in the most ominous way imaginable. On the evening of April 14, 1865, 5 days after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington by actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. That same night, Booth's co-conspirators also attacked Secretary of State William Seward at his home. The original plan included assassinating Vice President Johnson as well. The man assigned to kill Johnson was George Atzerodt, but he spent the evening drinking to steady his nerve, became too drunk to act, and ultimately lost his nerve entirely. Lincoln died in the early hours of April 15, 1865. Andrew Johnson, who had narrowly escaped death thanks only to his would-be assassin's cowardice, became the 17th President of the United States under the most tragic circumstances imaginable. The entire nation was in grief. Northerners mourned Lincoln as the father of the country. Southerners were confused and frightened about what would come next. And 4 million people who had just been freed from slavery waited to see whether the federal government would make good on its promises of freedom and equality. Andrew Johnson's answer would break the hearts of a great many of them. Before his death, Lincoln had his own plan for reconstructing the South, a relatively moderate approach that did not impose overly harsh conditions on the former Confederate states as the price of readmission to the Union. But many Republican members of Congress, particularly the faction known as the Radical Republicans, believed the South needed to undergo far more fundamental transformation to ensure that the people just freed from slavery would have genuine liberty and genuine citizenship, not merely on paper. Johnson rejected that approach entirely. In the first months of his presidency, while Congress was in recess, he unilaterally implemented his own Reconstruction plan without congressional approval. It had two defining features. It was enormously lenient toward the South, and it offered no meaningful protection to black people whatsoever. Johnson issued sweeping pardons to the vast majority of those who had served the Confederacy, including military officers and Confederate government officials, requiring only that they swear an oath of loyalty to the Union. This meant that men who had taken up arms against the United States just months earlier were permitted to re-enter political life as though nothing had happened. For the wealthy planters and aristocrats Johnson claimed to despise, he created a special pardon process that required them to come before him personally to petition for clemency. Many historians believe he savored the side of men who had once looked down on him, bowing before a poor tailor's apprentice and begging forgiveness. But in practice, he pardoned nearly all of them, and swiftly. What he did not do was protect the black people who had just been freed. When the Southern states recognized that Johnson would impose no real conditions regarding black rights, they moved quickly to reassert control over black people through new legal mechanisms. The result was a series of laws passed across the former Confederate states between 1865 and 1866, collectively known as the Black Codes. These laws varied in their specifics from state to state, but their shared purpose was the same: to force black people to continue laboring for white people under conditions that closely resembled slavery, while preventing them from moving freely, owning property, or accessing the legal system. In Mississippi, black people were prohibited from renting land in rural areas, effectively compelling them to work as laborers on white-owned farms. Any black person without a labor contract with a white employer could be arrested for vagrancy and sentenced to forced labor. In South Carolina, black people who wished to work in any occupation other than farming or domestic service had to obtain a special license and pay an annual tax. Across many states, black people could not own firearms, could not testify in court against white people, and could not marry white people. Black children who were orphaned or whose parents a court deemed unable to support them could be handed over to white families as apprentices without the family's consent. This was not freedom. This was slavery, renamed and wrapped in legal language. Johnson did nothing to stop these laws. When Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first law in American history to declare that all people born on American soil were citizens entitled to equal protection under the law, Johnson used his veto to strike it down. In his veto message, he argued that the bill was unconstitutional, that states had the right to define citizenship, and that extending citizenship to black people while many states had not yet been readmitted to the Union was inequitable. But beneath those legal arguments lay a blunter and more candid view he had expressed repeatedly in various contexts. He believed America was a white man's country, and that black people should not have equal rights with white people. Congress, for the first time in American history, overrode a presidential veto and enacted the Civil Rights Act without his signature. One of the most significant promises extended to black people during and after the Civil War was the redistribution of Southern plantation land to the newly freed. The most famous expression of this hope was the phrase 40 acres and a mule, the expectation that each black family would receive 40 acres to farm and the means to build a new life. That hope was not idle fantasy. General William Sherman, one of the Union's most celebrated commanders, had issued Special Field Order No. 15 in January 1865, distributing roughly 400,000 acres of abandoned coastal land in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida to black families. By the summer of 1865, approximately 40,000 black people had settled on that land and begun building their lives. Andrew Johnson revoked the order. He directed that all the land be returned to its pardoned white owners, including those who had taken up arms against the Union. The black families farming those plots were evicted, in many cases with the assistance of federal soldiers deployed not to protect black people, but to enforce their removal. The moment was profoundly and painfully symbolic. Black soldiers who had fought in the Union Army to liberate their people were now ordered to use force to drive those same people off the land they were cultivating. The decision to restore land to the former slaveholders determined the economic structure of the South for generations. Without land, black people had no economic foundation for genuine independence. They were compelled to return to working for the white men who had formerly enslaved them, this time under a sharecropping system in which tenants paid rent with a share of their harvest. The arrangement sounded more equitable than slavery, but in practice, it trapped black people in inescapable cycles of debt, since the landowner controlled both the rent charged and the price paid for the crop. If anyone still harbored doubts about Johnson's actual views, he dispelled them in remarks that stand in history as among the most explicitly racist statements ever uttered by an American president. In numerous speeches and messages to Congress, Johnson stated openly his belief that black people were intellectually and morally inferior to white people, that they were incapable of self-governance, and that granting them the vote would be a catastrophe for democracy. He declared that America had been built by white people and should be governed by white people. He warned that extending equal rights to black people would lead to racial intermixing and the degradation of American society. These were not private opinions whispered behind closed doors. They were submitted to Congress as official presidential messages, printed in newspapers, and read by millions of Americans. For black people across the South trying to build new lives, the message was unmistakable. The president of this country did not consider them citizens deserving of protection. By late 1865 and into 1866, the relationship between Johnson and Congress had shattered completely. The radical Republicans in Congress, led by figures such as Senator Charles Sumner and Representative Thaddeus Stevens, were determined to enact a more substantive Reconstruction program, regardless of Johnson's opposition. Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, dividing the South into 5 military districts under Union Army control, and requiring the former Confederate states to draft new constitutions that included voting rights for black men before they could send representatives to Congress again. Johnson vetoed the legislation. Congress overrode the veto. Johnson vetoed nearly every Reconstruction-related bill Congress sent him. Congress overrode his vetoes more times than any previous president in American history had been overridden. A grim record reflecting the degree to which Johnson had become completely isolated within the political system. To limit his power further, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act in 1867, stipulating that the president could not remove cabinet officials without Senate approval. The law was constitutionally questionable. It was later deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but at the time, it reflected Congress's genuine fear that Johnson was using his appointment and removal powers to undermine Reconstruction efforts. Johnson challenged the law directly by dismissing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a strong Reconstruction advocate whose removal he knew Congress would not sanction. It was precisely the kind of provocative act Congress had been waiting for. On February 24, 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Andrew Johnson, 126 to 47. The first time in history a U.S. president had been impeached. The formal charge was violating the Tenure of Office Act by removing Stanton, but the entire proceeding was in reality the culmination of 2 years of escalating conflict between the president and Congress over the future of black people in the South. The trial was held in the Senate over 2.5 months, with Chief Justice Salmon Chase presiding. The entire country followed with an intensity never seen before. The Senate gallery was packed every day, and admission tickets were sold for staggering sums on the black market. The final vote was 35 for conviction and 19 for acquittal, 1 vote short of the 2/3 majority needed to convict and remove him from office. Johnson escaped removal by the narrowest margin conceivable. Senator Edmund Ross of Kansas cast the deciding vote for acquittal, and it destroyed his political career entirely. His constituents in Kansas felt profoundly betrayed. Decades later, John F. Kennedy praised Ross in his book Profiles in Courage as an example of political bravery. But many modern historians argue that the vote was not courage at all. It was a serious error with devastating consequences for black Southerners across generations. While the political battle raged in Washington, something far more terrible was unfolding across the South, something Johnson's government made no effort to stop. As black people in the southern states began exercising their right to vote and participating in public life, violence against them escalated in a systematic and organized fashion. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865 by former Confederate officers and quickly became the most organized terrorist organization in American history, burning homes, beating, torturing, and murdering black people and white Reconstruction supporters across the South. In 1866, in Memphis, Tennessee, when a group of police officers and white civilians attacked the black community, 46 black people were killed, more than 80 were wounded, and hundreds of homes, schools, and churches were burned. A few months later in New Orleans, a similar massacre killed 34 black people and 3 white Reconstruction supporters. Johnson's response to these atrocities was to blame radical Republican members of Congress for inflaming the situation by demanding equal rights for black people. He did not send in troops, he did not call for investigations, he did not condemn the violence in any meaningful way. The message was clearly understood across the South. Violence against black people would go unpunished. Johnson understood that he would not receive the Democratic Party's nomination for a second term, and that he lacked sufficient support to win even if nominated. He left the White House in 1869 when Ulysses S. Grant was inaugurated, and before departing, he refused to attend his successor's inauguration, a petty gesture that reflected his character to the very last. Johnson later returned to the Senate as a senator from Tennessee in 1875, becoming the only former president in history to serve in the Senate after leaving the White House. He died the same year of a stroke, just a few months after returning to the chamber. The price black Southerners paid for Andrew Johnson's decisions stretched not for years, but for a century. When Congress finally imposed military Reconstruction over Johnson's vetoes, there was a brief period in which black people genuinely participated in Southern political life, electing their own representatives to Congress and state legislatures, establishing schools, and building communities. But when federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877 under the Compromise of 1877, which formally ended the Reconstruction era, every one of those gains was systematically reversed. Jim Crow laws replaced the black codes. Racial segregation was enshrined in statute. Organized violence continued to be used to maintain white supremacy. Had Johnson supported rather than sabotaged Reconstruction, had he protected rather than abandoned the people who had just been freed, American history might have taken a fundamentally different course. That does not mean every problem would have been solved, but a solid foundation of citizenship rights and land ownership established between 1865 and 1870 might have opened a different path. less painful, less cruel, and less damaging for millions of African Americans across the centuries that followed. Andrew Johnson was not the only person responsible for the decades of oppression that came after, but he stood at a crossroads in history with the power to take the road toward justice, and he chose the opposite road, deliberately, driven by his own racial hatred, by the contempt for black people he never once tried to conceal, and by his willingness to sacrifice the futures of millions in service of his personal convictions. History judges him by placing his name at the bottom of every ranking of American presidents. But the true cost of what he did and failed to do is not measured by his position on a historian's list. It is measured in the lives that were stolen, the generations imprisoned in poverty and legally enforced injustice, and the dream of genuine freedom that had to wait another century before it even had the chance to begin becoming real. Chapter 5. Woodrow Wilson, the 28th president, the man who preached freedom to the world while taking it away at home. There is a profound paradox at the very center of Woodrow Wilson's legacy, one that grows more painful the more closely you examine it. This was the man who stood before Congress and the world to declare that America's purpose in the First World War was to make the world safe for democracy. This was the man who drafted the famous 14 points, calling for the self-determination of peoples across the globe. This was the man who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919 for his efforts to build the League of Nations, the first international organization designed to prevent war between countries. And this was also the man who reimposed racial segregation across the entire federal government, fired hundreds of black civil servants solely because of the color of their skin, screened a film glorifying the Ku Klux Klan in the White House screening room, and signed laws allowing citizens to be imprisoned for daring to criticize the government or oppose the war. Woodrow Wilson preached freedom to the world while stripping it away at home. And to understand how he could do both simultaneously without perceiving any contradiction, we need to understand who he was, where he came from, and what kind of thinking had shaped him. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born in 1856 in Stanton, Virginia, the son of a Presbyterian minister. It is important to remember that he was born and raised in the South, and that his childhood was shaped by the South during and after the Civil War. His father had served as a chaplain in the Confederate Army, and later as a minister in Augusta, Georgia, during the Reconstruction years. His father's church had once been used as a prison and field hospital for Union prisoners of war. The young Wilson came of age in an environment that Southerners called the Lost Cause, a historical interpretation in which the War of Secession was not a war to preserve slavery, but a war defending states' rights and the Southern way of life. Those views never left him, even as he went on to become a distinguished professor of political science at Princeton University, then president of Princeton, then governor of New Jersey, then president of the United States. Beneath the refined academic language and the soaring speeches about democracy and freedom was a Southern man carrying the deep racial prejudices of the Southern world he had grown up in, prejudices he never truly abandoned, no matter how high he climbed. In 1912, Wilson won the presidency when the Republican Party was split between Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. He was the first president from the South since Andrew Johnson, and the first with a doctoral degree. Black Americans, many of them voting Democratic for the first time in decades rather than Republican, placed their hopes in him. He had promised fairness to all, and prominent black leaders, including W.E.B. Du Bois, co-founder of the NAACP, urged the black community to support Wilson. They would come to regret it. Before Wilson took office, the federal government agencies in Washington were among the few places in America where black and white people worked alongside one another, under conditions of relative equality. Black Americans had held government positions since the Reconstruction era, and though racial prejudice pervaded broader society, inside federal buildings, a degree of functional integration had persisted across decades. Wilson ended that within his first few months in office. His cabinet members, particularly Treasury Secretary William McAdoo and Postmaster General Albert Burleson, both Southerners with strongly segregationist views, immediately began imposing racial separation throughout their departments. Workspaces were divided. Restrooms were labeled white only and colored only. Cafeterias were partitioned by race. Black employees who had held supervisory positions were demoted or dismissed to eliminate any situation where they might manage white workers. Wilson did not merely tolerate these actions, he actively encouraged them. When a delegation of black leaders came to the White House to protest in 1914, led by journalist and activist Monroe Trotter, Wilson heard them out and then told them that segregation was actually in black people's best interests because it prevented friction and conflict between the races. When Trotter pushed back forcefully and exposed the dishonesty of that reasoning, Wilson grew angry and dismissed the delegation from the White House, announcing that he was offended by their manner. In private correspondence, Wilson expressed his views even more candidly. He regarded black people as less advanced in civilization and believed they required white guidance and oversight. These were not unusual views for a Southern man born in 1856, but they were views being enforced by the head of the most powerful federal government in the world, and that made all the difference. The result was that under Wilson, the federal bureaucracy became racially segregated in ways it had not been for many decades, and that condition persisted long after he left office. In February 1915, director D.W. Griffith released the first feature-length film in history, titled The Birth of a Nation. The film ran nearly 3 hours and told the story of two families through the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. But the way it told that story made it one of the most dangerous works of racist propaganda ever produced in the history of cinema. In the film, black people are portrayed as savage, crude, predatory, and especially threatening to white women. The most shocking scene depicts a young white woman leaping to her death rather than submit to assault by a black man. The film's heroes are the Ku Klux Klan, portrayed as defenders of white honor and purity against the threat posed by black people and Northern opportunists during Reconstruction. The film was based on a novel by Thomas Dixon, Jr., an old friend of Wilson's from their time together at Johns Hopkins. Dixon lobbied for a White House screening, and Wilson agreed. On February 18, 1915, The Birth of a Nation was shown in the White House screening room before Wilson, his cabinet members, and their families. The most widely repeated account of that evening is that Wilson remarked afterward that the film was like writing history with lightning, and that its only regret was that it was all so terribly true. That quotation was cited for decades as evidence of his enthusiastic endorsement. Later scholars have debated the authenticity of those precise words, but what cannot be debated is that Wilson screened the film, that he did not condemn it, and that the fact of its White House showing was used extensively in the film's promotional campaigns as a mark of presidential approval. The real-world consequences were catastrophic. Across America, waves of anti-black violence followed screenings of the film. In Atlanta, Georgia, a black man was dragged from a movie theater and killed by a mob inflamed by what they had just watched. In other states, riots broke out. Most significantly of all, the film directly inspired the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. William Joseph Simmons, who refounded the KKK in November 1915, later acknowledged that The Birth of a Nation played a significant role in his decision. The newly revived Klan rapidly grew to millions of members across America, not just in the South, but across the North and West as well. The NAACP and numerous civil rights organizations campaigned to have the film banned, with some success at the local level, but none at the federal level. Wilson did nothing to support those efforts. When the First World War erupted in Europe in 1914, Wilson initially pledged to keep America neutral. He won re-election in 1916 partly on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But by April 1917, after Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare and attempted to draw Mexico into an attack on the United States through the Zimmerman telegram, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. In his war message to Congress, Wilson spoke words that would enter history. The world must be made safe for democracy. It was one of the most stirring phrases ever uttered in American political life. But while he preached democracy and freedom before Congress, treating them as the universal rights of humanity that America must fight to defend around the globe, he was simultaneously enforcing a racially segregated system within his own government and preparing to sign laws that would allow American citizens to be imprisoned for speaking their minds. That contradiction was not accidental. It was a precise reflection of a man who could simultaneously believe in human freedom in the abstract and in white supremacy in practice, without perceiving any conflict between them, because in his thinking, black people and many other peoples simply did not belong to the category of full humanity he was invoking. In 1917, Wilson signed the Espionage Act, and in 1918, he signed the Sedition Act, two of the most serious violations of free speech in American history, in either peacetime or wartime. The core of the Espionage Act of 1917 was defensible, targeting actual espionage and activities that materially damaged the war effort. But it also contained extremely vague provisions about obstructing military recruitment and causing insubordination in the armed forces, provisions broad enough to apply to anyone who publicly criticized the war. The Sedition Act of 1918 went even further, prohibiting any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution, or the military or naval forces of the United States, or the flag. In other words, Wilson's law could send anyone to prison for saying something deemed abusive toward the government. And the law did not merely sit on paper. It was enforced aggressively and extensively in ways that today would be called authoritarian. Eugene V. Debs, leader of the socialist movement and a former presidential candidate, was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison for delivering an anti-war speech in Ohio. In that speech, he called for no violent action whatsoever. He simply expressed the view that war served the interests of the capitalist class rather than working people. He was convicted at the age of 63 and remained imprisoned until President Harding pardoned him in 1921. Hundreds of others were arrested and convicted for similar actions, distributing anti-war pamphlets, speaking at public meetings about their opposition to the war, and even writing letters critical of the conflict. A woman in Vermont was fined $100 for telling a group of young women that no one should fight for any reason. A minister in Oklahoma was sentenced to 10 years for distributing pamphlets that cited scripture to argue against military service. The Postal Service, under Postmaster General Burleson's control, refused to deliver publications deemed anti-war or socialist, effectively cutting off communications for a large segment of the labor movement and the anti-war movement. The Masses, a prominent left-wing arts and politics magazine, had its mailing permit revoked and was forced to shut down. Wilson knew all of this was happening. He was not a detached bystander. He had created the Committee on Public Information, a government propaganda agency led by George Creel, dedicated to producing and distributing pro-war materials while monitoring and suppressing anti-war voices. The committee organized an army of tens of thousands of 4-minute men, volunteers who appeared in movie theaters, churches, and public halls to deliver government-prepared 4-minute pro-war speeches. As the war progressed, hostility toward German Americans surged across the country, inflamed in part by the Wilson administration's own propaganda machinery. German Americans, many of whose families had lived in America for generations, were regarded with deep suspicion. Streets with German names were renamed. German music was banned in many public venues. Teachers of the German language were dismissed from schools. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage, in the same spirit that Americans, after September 11th, renamed French fries Freedom Fries. Some German Americans were physically attacked. Their property was vandalized. In a tragic episode in Illinois, Robert Prager, a 29-year-old German immigrant, was dragged from his home and lynched by a mob on the mere suspicion that he was a German spy, with no evidence of any kind. The men who carried out the lynching were tried, but acquitted by a jury that deliberated for just 25 minutes. The Wilson government did nothing meaningful to stop that wave of hostility. For Black Americans, the war briefly offered something that resembled hope. Hundreds of thousands of Black men served in the U.S. military, believing their sacrifice for their country would be rewarded with full citizenship after the war. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote his famous Close Ranks editorial, urging Black Americans to support the war effort and set aside their civil rights demands until after the fighting ended. But even in the military, Black soldiers were treated as second-class citizens. The U.S. Army was fully segregated by race. Black units were frequently assigned to labor duty rather than combat. When the American delegation arrived in Paris, U.S. officers warned the French not to treat Black American soldiers as equals of white soldiers, as doing so would create problems when they returned home. The French refused and treated Black American soldiers with ordinary human respect, an experience that many Black Americans would remember for the rest of their lives as the first time they had ever been treated as full human beings. When the war ended and Black soldiers came home, they returned with the hope that their sacrifice would produce change. What they received instead was the Red Summer of 1919, a wave of race riots and violent attacks on Black communities that swept from summer into autumn across at least 25 cities throughout America. In Chicago, violence lasted 13 days, killing 38 people, 23 of them Black, injuring more than 500 and leaving approximately 1,000 Black families homeless. In Elaine, Arkansas, an organized assault on a Black farming community killed an estimated 100 to 240 Black people, along with 5 white people, while no one was prosecuted for the Black deaths. In Washington, D.C. itself, violence erupted in the nation's capital, just blocks from the White House. Wilson's response? He did not clearly and unequivocally condemn the violence against Black people. He did not call for federal investigations. He did not deploy federal troops to protect Black communities, though he had the authority to do so. While Black Americans were being killed in the very capital of their country, their president remained silent. In January 1918, Wilson delivered his famous 14 points address to Congress, laying out his vision for a post-war world order built on principles including freedom of the seas, disarmament, peaceful settlement of territorial disputes, and above all, the self-determination of peoples, the right of nations to determine their own form of government. The 14th point, proposing a general association of nations to maintain world peace, was the most ambitious and visionary of all. Wilson arrived at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 as something close to a prophet, greeted by enormous crowds in Paris and across Europe who hailed him as a savior. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919 for these efforts. But there were things to which Wilson's principle of national self-determination did not apply. It did not apply to the Vietnamese, the Indians, the Algerians, and the other colonial peoples living under the rule of America's European allies. Ho Chi Minh was living in Paris at the time and attempted to reach the American delegation to submit a petition on behalf of Vietnamese autonomy. He never received a reply. Korean poets and activists appealed to Wilson for help when Japan suppressed the Korean independence movement. They received no help either. And it did not apply to Black Americans, who were being slaughtered during the Red Summer while Wilson was delivering speeches about freedom and democracy in Paris. The selectivity with which Wilson applied his lofty principles was not random inconsistency. It reflected a worldview in which the humanity entitled to freedom and democracy was a narrowly defined group, one that did not automatically include Black Americans, Asian peoples living under colonial rule, or non-Western peoples more broadly. After the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson returned to America to face the battle of persuading the Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and join the League of Nations. The Senate, under the leadership of Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, worried that League membership would draw America into future wars without congressional approval. Wilson decided to take his case directly to the American people through a nationwide speaking tour. Over 3 weeks, he traveled tens of thousands of miles and delivered dozens of speeches in increasingly failing health. On September 25, 1919, after an address in Pueblo, Colorado, he collapsed from exhaustion and was forced to cancel the remainder of the tour. On October 2, 1919, Wilson suffered a severe stroke that left him paralyzed on his left side and nearly blind in his left eye. The gravity of his condition was concealed from the public, from Congress, and even from most cabinet members for months. The effective manager of the U.S. government during the final months of Wilson's presidency was his second wife, Edith Wilson. She determined which documents reached him, conveyed instructions from him to other officials, and controlled who was permitted to see him. Many historians have since described this period as Edith Wilson's presidency, though she held no official title and no legal authority. It was a genuine constitutional crisis. The President of the United States was incapable of fulfilling his duties, but no one formally acknowledged it. No one invoked the 25th Amendment because it did not yet exist, and the machinery of American government continued to operate in a fog of uncertainty about who was actually making decisions for months on end. The Senate ultimately refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, meaning America never joined the League of Nations, the very organization Wilson himself had founded. It was the greatest personal and political tragedy of his life. Wilson left the White House in March 1921, disabled and embittered. He lived nearly 3 more years in Washington, dying on February 3, 1924. His legacy is among the most debated in all of American historical scholarship, and that debate reignited with considerable force in recent years. In 2020, Princeton University, where Wilson had served as president, voted to remove his name from its School of Public and International Affairs, citing his racist views as sufficient cause to remove a former leader's name from an institution. It was a historic decision by the very institution most closely associated with his legacy. Wilson's defenders argue that he was a product of his time, that his racial views were not markedly different from those of most white Americans of that era, and that his genuine achievements, the League of Nations, the Federal Reserve System, the Clayton Antitrust Act, deserve full recognition. All of that is true to a degree. But the problem with Woodrow Wilson is not simply that he held the common prejudices of his age. The problem is that he used his power as president to translate those personal prejudices into state policy, to actively reverse the progress Black Americans had made, and to construct legal structures of oppression whose damage long outlasted his own time in office. And the most painful thing about Woodrow Wilson is that he did all of this while preaching with genuine eloquence and genuine conviction about freedom, democracy, and the rights of humanity. He was not a hypocrite in the sense of knowing he was lying. He truly believed what he said. He simply could not or would not see that those principles had to apply to everyone, not just to the people he chose to include. That may be the most dangerous form of hypocrisy of all, not the kind that knows it is lying, but the kind that genuinely believes in its own nobility while causing harm to others without recognizing it, or without caring. Woodrow Wilson wanted to make the world safe for democracy. He simply forgot that democracy begins at home. Chapter 6. Warren G. Harding, the 29th President, the good-natured man surrounded by thieves. There is a famous remark that Warren G. Harding is said to have made to a close friend in the final days of his life, as the scandals within his administration began surfacing one by one. "I have no trouble with my enemies. It is my friends who are keeping me awake at night." Whether or not those were his exact words, they perfectly capture the central tragedy of Warren G. Harding's presidency. A man who was not bad by nature, who genuinely wanted to do good for his country, but who placed his trust in people who were willing to use friendship and loyalty as cover, while plundering everything they could lay their hands on from the national treasury. Harding's name today is nearly synonymous with corruption in American political history, and that is not entirely fair, but it is not entirely wrong either.
To understand why, we need to understand who he was, who surrounded him, and why one of the largest corruption scandals in American history could unfold under the leadership of a man that almost everyone who knew him described as warm, kind, and genuine. Warren Gamaliel Harding was born in 1865 in Blooming Grove, Ohio, the son of a country doctor. From an early age, what stood out most about him was his appearance. Harding was one of the most physically striking men ever to become president. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a handsome face, a magnificent head of silver hair, and a radiant smile. In an era before television, when the image of a politician was known primarily through newspaper photographs, Harding's looks were a genuine political asset. But beneath that impressive exterior was a man whose associates, even the most loyal among them, understood to lack intellectual depth and to be constitutionally incapable of saying no to those close to him. Harding knew this himself. He spoke about his own limitations with a candor that was almost painful. In one private letter, he wrote that he was a man of insufficient ability placed in a position demanding qualities he simply did not possess. The question is why he became president anyway. The answer lies in a combination of appearance, an agreeable personality, and perfect political timing. After 8 exhausting years under Woodrow Wilson, a world war, political repression, and bruising battles over the League of Nations, Americans wanted rest. They wanted a president who would not demand sacrifice, who would not lecture them about duty and mission, a man who could sit down over a beer and talk about baseball. Harding was that man. He described his own campaign platform not as heroism, but as a return to normalcy. And in that context, normalcy sounded like paradise. He won the 1920 election by the largest popular vote margin in American electoral history to that point, capturing 60.3% of the popular vote. Americans did not merely choose him, they chose him enthusiastically and decisively. When Harding moved into the White House, he brought with him a circle of old friends and associates from Ohio that people would later call the Ohio Gang. These were men he had known for years, men who had supported his political career, men he trusted because he had known them for a long time. He appointed them to important positions in his administration, not because of their abilities, but out of personal friendship and gratitude. The central figure among them was Jesse Smith, the close personal friend and assistant to Attorney General Harry Doherty. Smith held no official government title, but he had an office directly next to Doherty's at the Justice Department and had access to the entire legal machinery of the U.S. government. He used that access to run what was perhaps the most systematic commercial operation imaginable: selling presidential pardons, selling liquor permits during Prohibition, selling decisions not to prosecute individuals under investigation for fraud, and collecting payments from anyone willing to pay for favorable treatment from the Justice Department. The group's primary place of business was a house at 1625 K Street in Washington, which the press later called the Little Green House on K Street. There, at regular evening gatherings attended by government officials, businessmen, and favor seekers, people drank bootleg liquor, played cards, and conducted transactions that everyone present understood to be illegal. Harding himself sometimes attended similar gatherings at the White House, playing poker, drinking, and enjoying the ease of old friendships. Meanwhile, his administration was being systematically looted from within. Among the scandals that unfolded during Harding's presidency, one stands out in particular because its victims were American soldiers who had just come home from the First World War. Charles Forbes, whom Harding appointed as director of the Veterans Bureau, transformed the agency entrusted with caring for wounded and sick veterans returning from the front into a personal profit machine on a massive scale. Forbes, who had persuaded Harding of his competence and loyalty during a vacation in Hawaii, turned out to be a seasoned swindler whose military record was riddled with unanswered questions. Forbes extracted money from the Veterans Bureau in multiple ways. He sold off government stockpiles, medicines, bandages, linens, and medical equipment held in reserve for veterans' hospitals, to private contractors at absurdly low prices, often a tiny fraction of their actual value, and pocketed kickbacks from those contractors in return. In a single transaction, he sold millions of dollars worth of medical supplies to a private company at prices so far below market value as to be irrational, while the veterans' hospitals those supplies were meant to serve went without them. He also inserted himself into the construction contracts for veterans' hospitals, collecting payments from contractors in exchange for awarding them the work. His system was sophisticated enough that he organized inspection tours of construction sites with contractors that were in essence well-appointed pleasure trips during which cash changed hands discreetly. The total amount Forbes stole from the Veterans Bureau was estimated at approximately $200 million in the currency of the time, equivalent to many billions of dollars today. This was money allocated to care for American soldiers who had come home with shattered limbs, lungs destroyed by poison gas, and minds broken by what they had endured in the trenches of Europe. When Harding finally grasped what Forbes had been doing, according to an account given by witnesses present, he seized Forbes by the collar and shook him while screaming that he was the most treacherous son of a bitch he had ever known. But rather than dismissing Forbes on the spot and delivering him immediately to the law, Harding allowed him to resign and leave the country, giving him time to fly to Europe before any formal investigation began. Forbes was eventually tried after Harding's death and sentenced to 2 years in prison. The Veterans Bureau's legal counsel, Charles Kramer, shot himself before he could be questioned. But the scandal that made Harding's presidency synonymous with corruption in American history was Teapot Dome, and the story is complex and compelling enough to deserve telling in full. Teapot Dome was the name of a federal government oil reserve in Wyoming, a naval petroleum reserve, meaning oil set aside untapped for use by the U.S. Navy in a national emergency. Alongside Teapot Dome, there were 2 other naval petroleum reserves at Elk Hills and Buena Vista in California. These reserves were originally under the control of the Department of the Navy. But in 1921, Interior Secretary Albert Fall, one of Harding's old Senate friends, persuaded Harding to sign an executive order transferring management of the reserves from the Navy Department to the Interior Department. Navy Secretary Edwin Denby objected, but ultimately acquiesced. Harding signed the order. With control of the oil reserves in hand, Fall moved immediately. In 1921 and 1922, he secretly leased drilling rights to the Elk Hills and Buena Vista reserves to Edward Doheny's Pan American Petroleum Company and the Teapot Dome Reserve to Harry Sinclair's Mammoth Oil Company, without the competitive bidding that the law required. In return, Fall received from Doheny a no-interest loan of $100,000 delivered by Doheny's son in a black bag of cash, an image that would become one of the enduring icons of political corruption in American culture. From Sinclair, Fall received approximately $300,000 in various forms, including cash, government bonds, and livestock delivered to his ranch in New Mexico. The total in bribes Fall received was estimated at around $400,000, equivalent to several million dollars today. He used the money to renovate his ranch so conspicuously that neighbors and the local press began asking questions about how a government cabinet member on a fixed salary had suddenly acquired the funds for such extensive improvements. The Senate launched an investigation after several senators, notably Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, grew suspicious that something was deeply wrong with those oil transactions. As the inquiry began uncovering the truth, Fall resigned. Both Doheny and Sinclair were prosecuted. The legal aftermath of Teapot Dome dragged on for years and produced outcomes that sometimes seemed almost absurd. Albert Fall was the first and only figure in the affair to be convicted of bribery, sentenced to 1 year in prison, becoming the first cabinet member in American history to be criminally convicted for actions taken while in office. Meanwhile, Edward Doheny, who had handed Fall the $100,000 bribe, was acquitted of bribery by a jury in a result so contradictory it bordered on the incomprehensible. The man who received the bribe was convicted. The man who paid it was not.
Harry Sinclair was convicted not of bribery or corruption, but of contempt of the Senate for refusing to answer the investigating committee's questions and of having detectives follow the jurors during his trial. Teapot Dome became synonymous with political corruption for decades afterward, its name invoked whenever Americans wanted to describe the abuse of power for private gain at the highest levels of government. While Forbes was stealing from veterans and Fall was stealing from natural resources, Attorney General Harry Doherty and his close associate Jesse Smith were running a corruption operation that was subtler but even more comprehensive. Doherty and Smith turned the Justice Department into what one might describe as a power toll booth. Prohibition was at its height, and the bootleg liquor trade was the largest and most profitable industry in America. Producers and distributors of illegal alcohol needed special government permits to legitimize part of their operations, typically as licenses to manufacture alcohol for medical or religious purposes. Smith sold those permits. Beyond that, anyone under investigation or prosecution by the Justice Department who had sufficient money could contact Smith to have their problem resolved. Investigations could be shut down, sentences could be reduced, prosecutions could disappear. The price depended on the severity of the problem requiring resolution. When the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI, began showing signs of looking into the Ohio gang's activities, Smith shot himself in May 1923. His death was ruled a suicide, but some of his family members and certain historians later questioned whether he had been killed to prevent him from talking. Doherty himself survived multiple investigations and 2 criminal trials, both of which ended with the jury failing to reach a unanimous verdict, meaning no conviction. But President Calvin Coolidge, who succeeded Harding, forced Doherty to resign in 1924 when he refused to cooperate with investigators. Beyond the political and financial corruption, Harding's presidency was shadowed by rumors about his private life. Rumors that for decades were considered too sensitive for public discussion, but which were later confirmed to have a genuine basis in fact. Nan Britton was a young woman from Harding's hometown in Ohio who had admired him since girlhood when he was still a senator. Their relationship became intimate during his presidential campaign, and according to Britton, it continued throughout his time in office, including meetings in a small closet just off the Oval Office in the White House. In 1919, Britton gave birth to a daughter and named Harding as the father. After his death, she wrote a detailed book recounting their relationship and attempted to secure inheritance rights for her daughter from the Harding family. The family denied everything. For decades, Britton's account was regarded by many as unreliable. The story of a woman seeking fame or money. But in 2015, DNA testing comparing descendants of Harding's nephew with descendants of Britton's daughter confirmed that Harding was indeed the father of the child. The story Britton had told in 1927, dismissed as fabrication for nearly a century, turned out to be true. But Nan Britton was not the only woman in Harding's life. Carrie Fulton Phillips, the wife of one of Harding's friends in Ohio, had carried on a romantic relationship with him for approximately 15 years, and the collection of love letters the two exchanged during those years, preserved at the Library of Congress and only declassified in 2014, constitutes one of the most extensive and candid love correspondences ever written by someone who later became President of the United States. Phillips had actually threatened to expose the relationship when Harding ran for president in 1920. The Republican Party, alarmed at the prospect, arranged to pay both her and her husband a substantial sum of money and fund a trip to Japan, essentially bribing her into silence so that she would be out of the country for the entire campaign. Warren Harding died on August 2, 1923, at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco during a tour he called The Voyage of Understanding along the West Coast and into Alaska. He was 57 years old, and his health had been visibly deteriorating in the weeks before his death. The official cause was a heart attack, but several aspects of the circumstances were unusual. Harding's physician did not request an autopsy. His wife Florence refused to permit one. Florence Harding also burned a considerable quantity of her husband's personal documents and correspondence in the immediate aftermath of his death, an act that many people at the time, and historians since, have regarded with suspicion. In the context of the scandals steadily coming to light, with several people connected to those scandals dying in unusual circumstances, Jesse Smith having shot himself, and at least one other connected figure dying in circumstances that were not entirely clear. Some contemporaries and later historians raised questions about whether Harding's death was truly natural. A book published in 1930 by Gaston Means, a disreputable figure who had once been a Bureau of Investigation agent with ties to the Harding administration, accused Florence Harding of having poisoned her husband. The book was written by a man of deeply questionable credibility, and its allegations were never proven. Most modern historians believe Harding died of natural causes, likely related to heart disease and the enormous pressure of his final months in office. But the question was never definitively resolved because there was no autopsy. And that mystery, like so much else surrounding Harding's presidency, became part of the dark shadow that has hung over his memory ever since. In the interest of historical fairness, one thing Harding genuinely did right deserves mention, particularly in contrast to the man who preceded him. While Wilson had subjected Black Americans to segregation and turned a blind eye to racial violence, Harding traveled to Birmingham, Alabama in October 1921 and delivered a public speech calling for political and economic equality for Black people, an extraordinary statement for any American president of that era, and especially courageous when delivered on Southern soil before a racially segregated audience. He also offered support, though not with sufficient force, for legislative efforts to make lynching a federal crime. Beyond that, some of his appointments were genuinely outstanding. He named Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State, Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce, and Andrew Mellon as Treasury Secretary, all men of high ability and personal integrity. Hughes in particular was widely praised for organizing the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922, which produced significant international naval treaties limiting the arms race among the great powers. But those achievements were entirely submerged by the scandals, and there is good reason for that. When a president appoints both men of excellence and men of corruption to positions of power, and when the corrupt men do terrible things with the power entrusted to them, the final responsibility rests with the man who entrusted it. Harding was buried with full national honors amid genuine public grief. Americans had liked him as a person, and when he died, they mourned him sincerely. But within 2 years of his death, as the scandals broke publicly one after another, that image collapsed entirely. Teapot Dome became synonymous with corruption. Congressional investigations stretched on for years. Criminal trials played out before the public and filled newspaper front pages. The name Harding moved from mourned to despised in a remarkably short time. The question historians continue to debate is how much Harding actually knew about what was happening around him. Some believe he was genuinely ignorant, a true victim of friends who betrayed him. Others believe he knew more than he ever acknowledged and had simply chosen not to ask the questions whose answers he did not want to hear. The truth probably lies somewhere between those two positions. What can be said with confidence is that Harding lacked both the ability and the character needed to be a good president in any era, and that he was particularly ill-suited to his moment. He was not curious enough to ask the right questions, not disciplined enough to manage the people around him, and not courageous enough to confront his friends when he realized they were doing wrong, at least not early enough to prevent the damage. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of Warren G. Harding's story. Not a lesson about corruption or human wickedness, but a lesson about the price of placing an unqualified man in the highest office of power simply because he looked the part, had an agreeable manner, and said what people wanted to hear. America wanted a return to normalcy in 1920, and that is what it got. That normalcy turned out to include routine corruption, routine self-dealing, and the routine absence of genuine leadership. It was the kind of normal that no one wanted, but that sometimes takes a very high price to recognize for what it is.
Chapter 7. Franklin Pierce, the 14th president, the man who entered the White House in darkness and pulled the entire country in with him. Some presidencies begin with hope and end in disappointment. And then there is Franklin Pierce's, a presidency that began with a personal tragedy beyond anything one could imagine, then continued with a succession of political decisions so ruinous that nearly every significant choice he made pushed the country one step further toward catastrophe. When Pierce left the White House in 1857, America was standing on the edge of a civil war that his own actions had helped transform from a possibility into something approaching inevitability. But to fully understand Pierce's story, we cannot begin with politics. We must begin with a train and an 11-year-old boy. On January 6, 1853, less than 2 months before Franklin Pierce was to be inaugurated as president, he was traveling by train with his wife Jane and their only surviving son, Benjamin, called Benny by everyone in the family, from Boston back to their home in Concord, New Hampshire. 2 older sons had already died, one in infancy, one at the age of 3 from typhoid fever. The train was moving when it suddenly derailed. The car rolled down an embankment. Franklin and Jane Pierce escaped with minor injuries, but Benny, their 11-year-old boy, the last child they had left, was killed instantly in the accident, in front of both his parents. Jane Pierce, already a physically fragile and deeply anxious woman, collapsed entirely. She came to believe that Benny's death was God's punishment for her husband's political ambitions, and she never truly recovered. For much of Pierce's presidency, Jane Pierce lived in seclusion inside the White House, refusing to appear at social functions, writing letters to her dead son, and being called by Washingtonians the shadow in the White House. It was said that for many months after the accident, Pierce still saw the image of his son's broken body every time he closed his eyes. Pierce took office in a state of profound grief, and throughout the 4 years that followed, people would wonder whether that grief had affected his judgment, whether a man struggling to manage his own overwhelming pain could make sound decisions for a country facing historic challenges. Looking back, the answer was no. Franklin Pierce was born in 1804 in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, the son of Benjamin Pierce, a hero of the American Revolution and later governor of New Hampshire. He grew up in the shadow of a distinguished father and absorbed from him the ways of Northern politics, pragmatism, the capacity for compromise, and the art of keeping multiple factions reasonably satisfied. Like Andrew Jackson and Warren Harding, Pierce had been blessed with a striking appearance. He was tall, well-built, with a handsome face and an easy manner that drew attention effortlessly wherever he went. He studied law, built a political career quickly, and became a congressman and then a senator from New Hampshire while still relatively young. But Pierce carried 2 serious weaknesses throughout his life. The first was alcohol. He drank heavily, something he and those around him acknowledged as a problem. And the pressures of the presidency, combined with the grief of Benny's death, only made it worse. The second was an almost irresistible tendency to place harmony and compromise above principle, even when that compromise required him to look away from what many of his contemporaries already recognized as clear moral wrong. That second weakness would shape his entire presidency in the most damaging ways imaginable. The election of 1852 was one of the strangest episodes in American electoral history. Pierce was not the frontrunner at the Democratic National Convention. In fact, he was barely considered at all. But after 48 ballots without any candidate achieving a majority, with every faction exhausted and none willing to yield to any other, Pierce emerged as the compromise solution that all sides could accept, precisely because none of them felt strongly enough to oppose him. This is how a man with no enemies, because he held no principle strong enough to create enemies, became a presidential nominee. Pierce was chosen not for what he stood for, but because he stood for nothing forcefully enough to offend anyone. In the Electoral College, Pierce crushed his Whig opponent, Winfield Scott, 254 electoral votes to 42. But this was a victory born of fatigue and compromise, not conviction. And it posed the question, that the next 4 years would answer. Could a man selected because no one objected to him become the leader his country needed at a decisive moment? The answer was no. One of the earliest signals of where Pierce's presidency was heading was the composition of his cabinet. Though himself a Northerner from New England, Pierce filled his cabinet with Southerners who held strongly pro-slavery views. Most consequential among them was Jefferson Davis, whom Pierce appointed Secretary of War. The same Jefferson Davis who would later become President of the Confederate States during the Civil War. The relationship between Pierce and Davis was one of the most important forces shaping Pierce's presidency. Davis was intelligent, held clear principles, even if those principles included an unyielding defense of slavery, and possessed a powerful force of will. Pierce, with all his character weaknesses, was deeply susceptible to stronger personalities around him, and Davis was the strongest of them all. It was no coincidence that many of Pierce's most important and most destructive decisions aligned perfectly with the interests of the Southern states Davis represented. No decision in Pierce's presidency was more consequential or more catastrophic than his signing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act on May 30th, 1854. To understand why this act was a disaster, we need to understand what it replaced. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was a critical political settlement that had kept America from tearing itself apart for more than 3 decades. Under that agreement, the 36th parallel north was established as a dividing line. All new American territories north of that line would enter the Union as free states, while those to the south could choose to permit slavery. It was a compromise neither side was fully satisfied with, but both could live with, and for more than 30 years it served as a pressure valve, preventing the tension between the two sides from building to the point of explosion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, proposed by Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois and enthusiastically supported by Pierce, effectively tore the Missouri Compromise apart. It allowed the residents of the Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide the question of slavery for themselves through a principle called popular sovereignty. Both Kansas and Nebraska lay north of the 36th parallel, meaning under the Missouri Compromise, they were destined to enter the Union as free states. The Kansas-Nebraska Act nullified that commitment. Why did Pierce support this? Multiple reasons, all reflecting fundamental weaknesses in his character and thinking. He believed popular sovereignty was the genuinely democratic principle, that each community should decide its own affairs. He believed the act would finally resolve the slavery question by leaving it to the people rather than the federal government. And he was heavily influenced by the Southern members of his cabinet like Davis, who viewed the potential expansion of slavery into new territories as essential to the economic survival of the South. What Pierce could not or would not see was that abolishing the Missouri Compromise was not resolving the slavery question. It was pulling the pin on a grenade that the compromise had held in check for 30 years. The reaction in the North was an outrage unlike anything seen before. Dozens of members of Congress signed a document calling the Kansas-Nebraska Act a criminal conspiracy and a flagrant violation of a sacred national covenant. This was not the language of politicians disagreeing over policy. This was the language of people who felt morally betrayed. More consequentially still, the Kansas-Nebraska Act directly brought the Republican Party into existence. In the wake of its passage, anti-slavery Whigs, disaffected Northern Democrats, and members of smaller parties coalesced into a new political alliance built on a shared commitment to preventing the spread of slavery. That party would put Abraham Lincoln in the White House 6 years later and cause the Southern states to declare secession. Pierce had helped create the very political whirlwind that would consume America. The most immediate and direct consequence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was what happened in the Kansas Territory, and it made unmistakably clear just how dangerously naive Pierce's popular sovereignty theory was when it collided with reality. Almost immediately after the act passed, both pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions began pouring settlers into Kansas, each side racing to establish a demographic majority before elections could be held.
The Massachusetts Emigrant Aid Company sent thousands of northern settlers into Kansas. From just across the Missouri border, armed groups known as border ruffians crossed into Kansas to cast fraudulent ballots and intimidate northern settlers. The first Kansas territorial elections in March 1855 were an undisguised fraud. Approximately 5,000 men from Missouri crossed into Kansas on Election Day, voted illegally, and threatened the actual Kansas residents eligible to vote. The legislature produced by that process was almost entirely pro-slavery, and it immediately enacted a set of extraordinarily harsh laws, including the death penalty for assisting an escaping enslaved person, and prison sentences of 2 to 10 years for anyone who publicly stated that people have no right to own slaves. Pierce's response to this clear evidence of fraud was to recognize that fraudulent legislature as legitimate. He labeled the northern settlers who refused to accept the rigged election results as insurgents and affirmed the authority of the fraudulently elected body to govern Kansas. In 1856, the violence escalated into what could fairly be called a miniature civil war. On May 21, 1856, a pro-slavery mob attacked the town of Lawrence, the center of anti-slavery resistance, burning its hotel and newspaper offices and destroying settlers' property. In response, the fanatical abolitionist John Brown led a small group to Pottawatomie Creek, and in the night of May 24th to 25th, they dragged 5 men with pro-slavery sympathies from their homes and killed all of them with swords. Not one of the direct victims was himself a slaveholder. Attacks and reprisals continued throughout the summer of 1856. By year's end, an estimated 200 people had died from political violence in Kansas, a number that seems small compared to a full-scale war, but was enormous for such a sparsely populated territory. The press began calling it Bleeding Kansas, and that image became a powerful symbol of where Pierce's policies had led. This was no longer a political argument. This was Americans killing Americans over slavery. And all of it had begun with a decision made by Franklin Pierce. The violence of Kansas did not stay confined to that territory. On May 22, 1856, the day after Lawrence was sacked, an event occurred inside the United States Senate chamber in Washington that remains one of the most direct acts of political violence in the history of the American Congress. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a fierce opponent of slavery, had delivered a 2-day speech before the Senate titled "The Crime Against Kansas," in which he savagely attacked Pierce's Kansas policies and personally insulted several pro-slavery senators, including Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, with cutting personal contempt. 2 days later, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina, Butler's nephew, walked into the Senate chamber while Sumner was seated at his desk and beat him with a heavy metal-tipped cane until Sumner crumpled to the floor, his face covered in blood. Sumner could not immediately rise because his desk was bolted to the floor and he was trapped beneath it. It took him years to recover sufficiently to return to the Senate. In the North, the attack ignited a firestorm of outrage. Sumner was seen as a martyr, and his empty Senate seat during the years of his recovery was left vacant by Massachusetts as a symbol of the brutality of the slave power. In the South, Brooks was celebrated as a hero. Many Southerners sent him new canes with letters of congratulation. Pierce's response to all of this? A troubling silence. He did not clearly and decisively condemn the attack. He expressed no sympathy for Sumner. He continued to hold his pro-slavery position on Kansas, as though the near-fatal beating of a senator on the floor of the Senate chamber had no connection whatsoever to the policies he was enforcing. A lesser-known but equally significant aspect of Pierce's legacy was his administration's ambition to extend American territory in ways that could create additional pro-slavery states, thereby tilting the balance of power in Congress in favor of the South. The most explicit of these plans involved Cuba, the Spanish colonial island just off the coast of Florida. Cuba had a plantation economy built on enslaved labor similar to the American South, and many Southerners viewed it as an ideal candidate for annexation to the United States as a new slave state. Pierce actually directed 3 American ambassadors in Europe to hold a secret meeting and draft a document recommending U.S. policy toward Cuba. The result was the Ostend Manifesto of 1854, a secret document in which the 3 ambassadors argued that if Spain refused to sell Cuba to the United States, America would be justified in wresting it by force if Spain's continued possession threatened American security. Stated plainly, this was a proposal for seizing Cuba through war if purchase failed, primarily to create another slave state. When the Ostend Manifesto leaked to the press, it triggered fierce opposition both in America and in Europe. Pierce was forced to disavow it as official U.S. policy and abandon the plan. But the leak confirmed what many in the North had already suspected. Pierce and those around him were actively working to expand the reach of slavery, not only into existing American territories, but beyond America's borders if necessary. Beyond Cuba, the Pierce administration was also involved in murky schemes to intervene in Nicaragua and other Central American nations, partly with the same goal of creating additional territory that could be organized along the South's slaveholding model. Among the most extraordinary figures of the Pierce era was William Walker, a Tennessee-born American who stood barely 5 feet tall, but possessed enormous ambition and a complete absence of ethical restraint. Walker was a filibustero, a man who commanded private armies to invade and seize foreign countries for personal gain. In 1855, Walker led a small band of Americans into Nicaragua, intervened in an ongoing civil war there, and by 1856 had declared himself president of Nicaragua. One of the first things Walker did as president of a Central American nation was to re-legalize slavery in Nicaragua, which had been abolished long before, evidently hoping to attract Southern settlers and transform Nicaragua into a kind of outpost for Southern interests in Central America. Pierce's response? He recognized Walker's government as legitimate, making himself the first and only American president to formally recognize a regime established by an illegal private conqueror. The recognition did not last long, since Walker quickly alienated nearly everyone in Central America, was overthrown in 1857, and was eventually captured and shot in Honduras in 1860. But Pierce's willingness to recognize Walker's regime revealed the lengths to which he was prepared to go in service of pro-slavery interests, even when doing so required violating the most basic principles of international law. By 1856, the political damage Pierce had inflicted on himself was beyond repair. The Democratic Party, the party whose president he was, refused to nominate him for a second term. This is a rare occurrence in American politics, a sitting president being denied renomination by his own party, and it speaks to the depth of his failure in the eyes of even his fellow partisans. Instead, the Democrats nominated James Buchanan, whom we have already encountered in an earlier chapter, and whom we have already seen proved equally unequal to the crisis Pierce had left behind. Pierce received the news that he would not be nominated with an outward show of composure, but those close to him reported that the rejection cut him deeply. He left the White House in 1857 as a man abandoned by his party, judged harshly by history even before his term had fully ended, watching the country he had governed racing toward catastrophe at ever-increasing speed. Pierce's life after the White House was a bleak picture. Jane Pierce, who had never truly recovered from Benny's death, died of tuberculosis in 1863, leaving Pierce entirely alone. No children, no wife, no political future, and no respect from most of his contemporaries. During the Civil War, Pierce continued to express views sympathetic to the South and critical of Lincoln's war policies, which only deepened his isolation from Northern public opinion. He was reported to have called Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation unconstitutional and unnecessary. When news of Lincoln's assassination arrived, an angry crowd gathered outside Pierce's home in Concord, demanding that he fly the national flag in mourning. Pierce stepped outside and faced the crowd, arguing that his patriotism needed no outward symbol to prove itself. It was the last moment of his public life that anyone recorded with any detail. Pierce died in 1869 of cirrhosis of the liver caused by alcoholism. A sad and somewhat foreseeable end for a man whose drinking had been his most constant companion through the most painful years of his life. He was buried in Concord, New Hampshire, at a small funeral that in no way reflected the fact that the man being interred had once been the most powerful person on earth. When historians rank American presidents, Franklin Pierce consistently appears in the bottom 5 to 10. What is notable is that he was not bad in the way Nixon was, actively choosing a path of law-breaking and deception. He was not bad in the way Andrew Johnson was, carrying deep racial prejudice and translating it directly into national policy. Pierce was bad in a more particular way, and in some respects, a more frightening one. He was bad because he was too eager to please everyone, too afraid of confrontation, and too willing to compromise even when the compromise required him to close his eyes to obvious injustice. He was not a bad man in the ordinary sense. Those who knew him personally consistently described him as pleasant, generous, and sincerely wanting the best for his country. But those personal virtues were not enough to compensate for a lack of political backbone, a lack of the ability to hold firm against stronger personalities, and a lack of the vision to see that in critical historical moments, artificial peace achieved by accommodating injustice is not peace at all, but a ticking clock. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, the defining decision of Pierce's presidency, was signed on May 30, 1854. The guns that opened the Civil War fired at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. Between those two dates lay 7 years, enough time for the fractures that Pierce had helped create and widen to deepen into a chasm that no further compromise could fill. Franklin Pierce wanted peace. He wanted unity. He wanted everything resolved smoothly without anyone suffering too much. But there are moments in history when genuine peace requires the courage to confront injustice directly, not to arrange a comfortable accommodation with it. Pierce did not possess that courage, and the country paid for that deficiency in the blood of hundreds of thousands of people in the years after he left office. That is Franklin Pierce's legacy, not the legacy of malice, but the legacy of weakness. And sometimes in history, weakness in the right place at the right moment can cause damage every bit as great as evil intent. Chapter 8. Millard Fillmore, the 13th president, the man who signed his own death warrant and thousands of others. There is something peculiar about Millard Fillmore that strikes you almost immediately when you begin to study him. He is one of the least known presidents in American history. Yet the decisions he made during his brief 3 years in office carried consequences that stretched across decades and touched the lives of millions of people in the most painful and unjust ways imaginable. He was not a compelling enough figure to inspire passionate hatred. He did not have a forceful enough personality to create sworn enemies or devoted admirers. He was simply an ordinary man, not especially brilliant, not especially wicked, who stepped into one of the most critical moments in American history and made choices that nearly everyone looking back can see were wrong. But that ordinariness does not diminish the consequences of those choices. If anything, it makes them more troubling in a certain way, because it reminds us that terrible things in history are not always done by monsters or villains. Sometimes they are done by entirely ordinary people who simply place political convenience and short-term peace above justice and human beings. Millard Fillmore was born in 1800 in Summerhill, New York, into a family of grinding poverty. His father rented a farm he did not own, and the family lived in a small log cabin on the western frontier of New York State, a place that was still rough and unforgiving country. Fillmore had little formal schooling for years, and his father apprenticed him to a cloth weaver when he was still a teenager, because the family needed money and could not afford another mouth to feed. But Fillmore had something many people in his circumstances did not: a hunger for reading and a fierce ambition to escape poverty. He taught himself law while working as a weaver, borrowing money to buy books and reading in whatever spare hours he could find. He eventually secured a clerkship at a local law firm and opened his own practice. From there, his path into politics began. Slow but steady, from the state legislature to the federal House of Representatives, then to the position of New York State Comptroller. Fillmore's story sounds like a story about the American dream, about a man who rose from nothing through his own efforts. And in one sense, it was. But the American dream story usually skips over the more important question. Once that man achieved power, what did he do with it? Whose dream was served, and whose was crushed in the process? For Fillmore, the answers to those questions were not kind. In 1848, Fillmore was nominated as the vice presidential candidate running alongside Zachary Taylor, the celebrated general of the Mexican-American War. The pairing was typical of the compromise politics of the era. Taylor was a Southerner from Louisiana, a large slaveholder and military hero, while Fillmore was a Northerner from New York, representing the wing of the Whig Party that was uncomfortable with slavery, but not strong enough to challenge it. The two men had no particularly close personal relationship, and even less agreement on policy. Taylor held far firmer views about limiting the expansion of slavery into the territories newly won from Mexico, while Fillmore leaned toward accommodation and avoiding confrontation with the South on that question. When Taylor and Fillmore were elected and took office in early 1849, Fillmore stepped into the vice presidency in the truest traditional sense of the role, almost entirely meaningless politically, presiding over Senate sessions in which he had no vote except to break ties, and waiting. Taylor handled the serious business of governing without consulting his vice president. Then on July 9, 1850, Zachary Taylor died suddenly of acute gastroenteritis, just 16 months into his term. Millard Fillmore, a man almost no one had thought about, became the 13th President of the United States. And immediately, he made decisions that revealed he and Taylor were entirely different men in character and principle. To understand what Fillmore faced and what he decided, we need to understand the political landscape of 1850, a year in which America was standing on the edge of genuine collapse. The end of the Mexican-American War in 1848 had brought the United States an enormous swath of territory: California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and more. The immediate question was whether slavery would be permitted in those new lands, and that question drove Congress into a political crisis lasting many months. The South, alarmed that the balance of power in Congress was tilting toward the North as more free states were admitted, insisted that slavery be allowed in the new territories, at least to some degree. The North, especially the growing abolitionist movement, demanded the opposite. California, flooded by hundreds of thousands of settlers in the gold rush of 1849, had drafted a constitution prohibiting slavery and applied to join the Union as a free state. If admitted, it would break the numerical balance between free and slave states in the Senate, which the South regarded as an existential threat. Henry Clay, the veteran Kentucky statesman famous as the Great Compromiser for his role in earlier settlements, proposed a complex package of measures intended to satisfy both sides enough to avert a crisis. That package became known as the Compromise of 1850. Zachary Taylor, before his death, had strongly opposed several elements of the compromise, particularly those he viewed as excessive concessions to the South. He also did not wish to sign a strengthened new fugitive slave law, which the South regarded as a non-negotiable condition of any settlement. With Taylor alive, the compromise remained deadlocked. When Fillmore took the presidency, the deadlock broke. He replaced Taylor's entire cabinet with supporters of the compromise. He made clear that he would sign the new Fugitive Slave Act if Congress passed it. And when Congress passed it, he did. That was the defining moment of Fillmore's presidency, and it deserves far more careful examination than most textbooks give it. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was not the first such law. A similar act had existed since 1793, but it was rarely enforced in practice because many northern states had passed their own personal liberty laws, preventing state officials from assisting in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. The South was deeply dissatisfied with this situation, and one of their central demands in the compromise negotiations was a new, stronger federal law with real teeth. The new act that Fillmore signed in September 1850 met that demand fully, and then went further still. Under the new law, special federal commissioners were empowered to adjudicate fugitive slave cases. Critically, they were paid $10 if they ruled in favor of returning the captured person to the slaveholder, but only $5 if they ruled in favor of releasing that person. This explicit financial incentive was not an accidental flaw, but a deliberate design feature. The person arrested and claimed as a fugitive slave had no right to testify before the tribunal. They could not speak in their own defense. No jury was used. State courts had no jurisdiction to intervene. In practical terms, this was a legal system in which the accused had no meaningful mechanism for self-protection. But what made this act truly catastrophic? What transformed it from a law about escaped enslaved people into a threat to every black person in the North was that it was not limited in practice to those who had actually escaped from slavery. Because the accused could not defend themselves, and because the financial incentives tilted toward the ruling of return to owner, any free black person in the North could be seized and declared a fugitive slave with no effective legal means to prove otherwise. And that is precisely what happened. Almost immediately after the law took effect, what its opponents had warned began to occur. Black people who had lived freely in the North for years, even decades, people with jobs, families, and stable lives, suddenly became targets for slave catchers coming up from the South. In Boston, a man named Shadrach Minkins was arrested in February 1851 at the restaurant where he worked. He had lived freely in Boston for years. A group of local black residents intervened and freed him while he was being escorted to the courthouse, and he was smuggled to safety in Canada. Federal authorities prosecuted those who had freed him. In Philadelphia, in Cincinnati, in New York, and across other northern cities, similar arrests took place. Black people lived in a state of constant fear. Many fled to Canada, abandoning their jobs and possessions. Estimates suggest that approximately 20,000 black people left the United States for Canada in the years immediately following the Act's signing. Among the most famous cases was that of Anthony Burns in Boston in 1854. Burns, a black man who worked and lived in Boston, was arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act. The case sparked enormous outrage throughout the city. Thousands gathered in the streets. A group even attacked the federal courthouse in an attempt to free Burns, without success, and a soldier was killed in the attempt. The federal government deployed hundreds of soldiers to ensure Burns was escorted to the harbor and returned to Virginia. The cost of returning one man to slavery in the Burns case was estimated at approximately $100,000, an enormous sum at the time. Those scenes, black people being dragged away while thousands of furious Northerners watched helplessly, produced political and emotional effects that could not be undone. They transformed many Northerners who had been indifferent to slavery in the South into people deeply and personally outraged by a system that now reached directly into their own communities. Harriet Beecher Stowe later recounted that it was precisely the scenes of black people being arrested on northern streets under the Fugitive Slave Act that inspired her to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel published in 1852 that became one of the best-selling books of the 19th century and did more to shift Northern public opinion on slavery than any speech or political pamphlet. When Lincoln met Stowe in 1862, he was reported to have said, "So this is the little lady who made this big war." No one can know whether that book would ever have been written had Fillmore not signed the Fugitive Slave Act. This is the crucial thing to understand about Fillmore. Unlike some politicians who claim they were unaware of the consequences of their actions, Fillmore understood very clearly the nature of the law he was signing. He received thousands of protest petitions from Northern constituents. He heard the powerful speeches of opponents in the Senate, describing in detail what the law would do to free black people in the North. He read the reports of unjust arrests occurring almost immediately after the law took effect. And he signed it anyway. More than that, he enforced it more aggressively than any president was obligated to. When cases like that of Shadrach Minkins occurred, and black people were freed by their local communities, Fillmore did not extend merciful indifference. He demanded prosecutions of those who had participated in the rescue. He declared he was prepared to deploy federal troops to enforce the law if necessary. He explained his position in the language of constitutional duty and the preservation of the Union, that he was obligated to enforce the law of the land, that the Compromise of 1850 was the necessary solution to prevent secession and civil war, and that he was sacrificing short-term political advantage to protect the long-term integrity of the Union. That argument contained a measure of truth. The fear of national disintegration was real, not a pretext. Many people of that era, including some whom history has judged far more favorably than Fillmore, also believed that some form of compromise was necessary to hold off secession. Daniel Webster, one of the most revered orators and statesmen in the North, spoke in support of the Compromise of 1850 and was condemned by many of his Massachusetts constituents for it. But the argument that it was necessary to save the Union contained a fundamental flaw. It placed the survival of the governmental structure above the survival and dignity of actual human beings. It said that in order to keep the Union from fracturing today, we are willing to accept that free black people in the North can be seized and sold into slavery. That is not an ethical calculation most people today, or even many people at the time, could accept. One interesting aspect of Fillmore is that he was not an enthusiastic champion of slavery in the manner of Jackson or Andrew Johnson. He did not own enslaved people. He grew up in the North in a community without slavery, and in the early years of his political career, he had even voted for some measures limiting the expansion of slavery. But Fillmore's view of black people and of slavery can best be described as strategic indifference. He did not feel the injustice of slavery strongly enough to prioritize addressing it over any other political goal. He did not view black people as full citizens whose rights and dignity deserved federal protection in the same way as white citizens. That did not mean he actively wished them harm, but it meant that when forced to choose between his own political interests and the safety of black people, he did not hesitate long before choosing the former. That strategic indifference was most visible in his response to the growing evidence that the law he had signed was being used to seize not only genuine fugitives, but also people who had been entirely free for decades in the North. He did not call for investigations. He did not propose amendments to better protect free black people. He continued enforcing the law while the people being swept into it had no means of defending themselves. The decision to sign the Fugitive Slave Act not only shaped American history, it directly destroyed the Whig Party that Fillmore represented and indirectly destroyed his own political career. The Whig Party had been constructed as a loose coalition of different interest groups from both North and South, held together not by shared conviction on fundamental questions, but by shared opposition to the Democratic Party. Slavery had always been the latent fracture that could shatter that coalition, and the Compromise of 1850 exploited that fracture beyond repair. The Northern Whigs, including those known as the Conscience Whigs, were furious at Fillmore for signing the Fugitive Slave Act and refused to support him. When the Whig National Convention assembled in 1852, rather than nominating Fillmore for a full term of his own, it chose Winfield Scott. That was the first political blow. The Whig Party disintegrated entirely after its disastrous electoral defeat in 1852 and formally collapsed in the mid-1850s when the Kansas-Nebraska crisis pushed disaffected Northerners into the new coalition that became the Republican Party. Fillmore, with no party to return to, spent several years as a man without political affiliation. If Fillmore's story had ended in 1853 when he left the White House, his legacy might have been summarized simply as the man who signed the Fugitive Slave Act and left damaging consequences behind. But Fillmore did not stop there. In 1856, He made what may have been the worst decision of his political career, one that revealed his willingness to go to darker places than anything he had done as president. The Know-Nothing movement, officially called the American Party, had emerged in the early 1850s as a nativist and anti-Catholic force. The name Know-Nothing came from the fact that when members were asked about their organization, they were instructed to answer, "I know nothing." The movement primarily targeted Catholic immigrants, particularly the Irish and Germans flooding into America in great numbers during those years. The Know-Nothings propagated the idea that Catholic immigrants were loyal to the Pope rather than to the American Constitution, that they were invading American culture and institutions, and that only people born on American soil of American-born parents were truly fit to participate in political life. These were the familiar arguments of nativism in every era and every country, wrapped in the language of a specifically American patriotism. The Know-Nothing movement also used real physical violence against immigrants. Riots targeting Catholic communities erupted in multiple cities. Catholic churches were burned. Immigrants were attacked in the streets. Millard Fillmore, former President of the United States, a man who had once sworn to protect the Constitution and the rights of all citizens, became this party's presidential candidate in 1856. When asked about his support for the American Party, Fillmore gave vague answers about believing in America for Americans and expressing concerns about the influence of foreign institutions, meaning the Catholic Church, on American politics. He attempted to position himself as a moderate within the movement, unconnected to its violence, merely a champion of the genuinely American values it claimed to represent. But standing as a party's candidate is an act of endorsement of that party and of what it stands for, regardless of how much the candidate tries to distance himself from the movement's worst elements. Fillmore knew who the Know-Nothings were and what they did, and he still chose them as the vehicle for his attempt to return to the White House. He won the electoral votes of Maryland and approximately 21% of the national popular vote. Not a bad showing for a third-party candidate, but not enough to return him to power. Democrat James Buchanan won the election. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Fillmore sided with the Union in the sense that he did not support secession. But he strongly opposed Lincoln's war policies, particularly those he regarded as unconstitutional or extreme. He criticized the Emancipation Proclamation and repeatedly expressed the view that Lincoln was destroying the Constitution while claiming to defend it. In Buffalo, where he had lived for many years and was a prominent citizen, he organized and commanded a middle-aged Home Guard unit called the Union Continentals, an organization that was more ceremonial than militarily useful. This was his contribution to the war effort. When Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, Fillmore was among the first to publicly express grief and issue a statement condemning Booth's act. But because his house was not flying the national flag during the period of mourning, an angry crowd in Buffalo poured black ink on the front of his house as punishment for what they saw as a lack of patriotism. Whether the story is entirely accurate or not, it captures the isolated position Fillmore had placed himself in through years of wrong decisions. Fillmore died in 1874 in Buffalo at the age of 74 of a stroke. His funeral was conducted with the respect owed to a former president, but no one present could honestly say that the man being honored had been great or important in any positive sense of those words. Millard Fillmore appears regularly on lists of the worst American presidents, alongside Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, and Pierce. But among that group, Fillmore may be the hardest to judge, because he was not a straightforwardly bad man. He was not a fanatical racist like Andrew Johnson. He was not wholly paralyzed like Buchanan. He was not a deliberate inciter of violence like Jackson. He was an ordinary man with enough intelligence to understand what was happening around him, enough political experience to know his choices had consequences, and enough moral sensitivity to feel uncomfortable with some of what he was doing, but not enough courage or principle to do otherwise. That is a particular kind of failure, and in some ways a very common one in history. Not the failure of the wicked, but the failure of someone good enough to know the right thing and not good enough to do it, when doing it required paying a price. Fillmore decided to sign the Fugitive Slave Act because he believed it was necessary to protect the Union. He may have been right that the Compromise of 1850 bought an additional decade of peace, but the price of that decade of peace was paid in the freedom and safety of black people who had no voice in that transaction. That is a Faustian bargain that history does not allow its signatories to escape accountability for, simply by saying they had no choice. And his know-nothing legacy is even harder to defend. No historical circumstances, no Southern pressure, no threat of secession can explain why a former president of the United States chose to become the standard-bearer of a movement built on hatred of immigrants and Catholics. It was simply the choice of a man who placed political ambition above the basic dignity of human beings. For the second time in his career, after doing the same thing to black people when he signed the Fugitive Slave Act. Millard Fillmore is a reminder that ordinariness is no shield against moral responsibility, and that the choice not to do the right thing when the right thing demands courage is itself a moral choice, with real consequences for real people, regardless of whether the person making that choice feels troubled by it or not. Chapter 9. George W. Bush, the 43rd President, the man who led America into 2 wars on reasons that were never proven. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the world changed. 4 commercial aircraft were hijacked. 2 slammed into the World Trade Center in New York. 1 struck the Pentagon in Washington. And 1 plunged into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers attempted to retake control. Nearly 3,000 people died within the space of a few hours. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in American history, and the first time since the War of 1812 that an enemy had struck directly on American soil. George W. Bush, who had taken office just 8 months earlier following the most contested election in modern history, was suddenly a wartime president. The country stood behind him almost unanimously. The world stood behind him. Even his most bitter political opponents reached out in support. At that moment, Bush's approval rating reached 90%, the highest ever recorded for any American president. The question was never whether Bush had the right to respond. He did. The question was how he responded, against whom, on the basis of what information, and with what consequences for the millions of people who had no voice in those decisions. And the answers to those questions are why the name George W. Bush appears on this list. George Walker Bush was born in 1946 in New Haven, Connecticut, the eldest son of George H.W. Bush, who would himself become the 41st President of the United States. He grew up in Midland and Houston, Texas, in a privileged family that nonetheless worked to maintain the image of the plain-spoken, unpretentious Texas heartland. Bush attended Andover, one of the most prestigious prep schools in America, then went to Yale as his father had, then earned an MBA from Harvard Business School. He received the finest education that money and family name could provide. But his academic record was not distinguished, and he later acknowledged that during his college years, he drank heavily and was not serious about his studies. During the Vietnam War, rather than serving in combat as many less privileged contemporaries were required to do, Bush joined the Texas Air National Guard, a choice widely used by sons of powerful families to avoid deployment to Vietnam. His military record during this period remained a source of controversy throughout his career, with questions about whether he had actually completed his full National Guard obligations that were never satisfactorily resolved. Then came years in the Texas oil industry, where his companies performed poorly before being rescued by investors with family connections. Then part ownership of the Texas Rangers baseball team. Then governor of Texas in 1994, re-elected by a landslide in 1998. Bush was not unintelligent, though his opponents sometimes portrayed him that way. He possessed practical intelligence and an ability to connect with ordinary people that many more academically inclined politicians could not match. But he was also a man with limited knowledge of the world beyond America's borders before entering the presidency. someone who preferred simple and decisive action over complex, multi-directional analysis, and someone who placed personal loyalty and gut conviction above evidence and analysis at the most critical decision-making moments of his term. That combination, in the context of what followed September 11th, would lead to catastrophic consequences for millions of people. Before addressing what Bush did as president, it is necessary to acknowledge how he became president, because that story is itself one of the most contested episodes in the history of American democracy. The 2000 election between Bush and Vice President Al Gore ended on election night without a clear result, because Florida, the state on which the entire electoral outcome depended, was too close to call. That night, television networks declared Gore the winner of Florida, then retracted the call, then declared Bush the winner, then retracted that call as well, in a media chaos unlike anything previously seen. A recount began and stretched on for 36 days, consumed by legal battles over defective ballots, inconsistent counting procedures across counties, and the now famous hanging chads, incompletely punched ballots that automated machines could not reliably count. Finally, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a 5-4 ruling that fell almost perfectly along partisan lines, ordering a halt to the Florida recount, effectively delivering the presidency to Bush. Al Gore received approximately 540,000 more popular votes than Bush nationally. Bush won the Electoral College 271 to 266, clearing the required threshold of 270 by a single vote. Florida was awarded to Bush by a margin of approximately 537 votes out of millions cast in that state. Many Americans, particularly those who had voted for Gore, never fully accepted the legitimacy of Bush's presidency. That wound, though largely papered over by the wave of national unity following September 11th, never fully healed during his 8 years in office. Bush's first response after September 11th was to attack Afghanistan, where Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda organization had planned and carried out the attack under the protection of the Taliban government. This decision received broad support not only within the United States, but among many other nations, and NATO, for the first time in its history, invoked Article 5 of its charter, declaring that the attack on one member was an attack on all. The initial military campaign in Afghanistan moved quickly and effectively. The Taliban were toppled within months, and al-Qaeda's organizational structure in Afghanistan was dismantled. But from the very first months, decisions were made that would shape the war in ways from which it could never recover. In December 2001, Osama bin Laden and most of al-Qaeda's senior leadership were surrounded in the Tora Bora mountain complex in eastern Afghanistan. Rather than deploying sufficient American forces to seal off every escape route, the Bush administration relied primarily on local Afghan warlord militias to conduct the siege. Bin Laden and many of his associates slipped across the border into Pakistan. That moment was later described by many military and intelligence experts as the single most consequential strategic error of the entire war on terror. Bin Laden would live in hiding for years afterward, continuing to inspire terrorist attacks around the world, and was not killed until 2011 under President Obama, a decade after the attacks he had masterminded. The reason sufficient American forces were not deployed to surround Tora Bora, according to multiple accounts from inside the Bush administration, was partly that attention and resources were already beginning to be redirected toward a different target: Iraq. This is the center of the story of George W. Bush, and why his presidency is regarded as one of the worst policy failures in the history of modern America. From the days immediately following September 11th, a group of senior officials in the Bush administration, led by Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, began pushing to use the September 11th attacks as an opportunity to invade Iraq and topple Saddam Hussein. This occurred even though there was no evidence connecting Saddam Hussein to September 11th, a fact that the Bush administration itself later confirmed. Why Iraq? Different people within the administration offered different reasons. Wolfowitz and the faction known as the neoconservatives believed that overthrowing Saddam and establishing a democracy in Iraq would transform the Middle East in a pro-American direction and eliminate the conditions that produce terrorism. Cheney and others worried about the possibility that Iraq might develop weapons of mass destruction and share them with terrorist organizations. Some analysts later added the story of Iraqi oil and economic interests, though this is a more complex claim that cannot be reduced to a simple accusation. Whatever the actual reasons, the fundamental problem was that the Bush administration decided to invade Iraq before there was sufficient evidence to justify that decision, then actively searched for and presented information to build the case for invasion, rather than letting evidence lead to conclusions. The primary argument used to persuade Congress, the American public, and the world was that Iraq was possessing and developing weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons, biological weapons, and possibly a nuclear weapons program. Cheney appeared on television and declared there was no doubt that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. In his 2003 State of the Union address, Bush declared that Iraq had attempted to purchase uranium from Africa to build a nuclear bomb, a claim based on intelligence that his own intelligence officials had already raised serious questions about. On February 5, 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell, regarded as the most credible and moderate voice in the Bush administration, stood before the United Nations Security Council and spent hours presenting evidence that Iraq was concealing a weapons of mass destruction program. He displayed satellite photographs, played intercepted telephone conversations, and offered detailed intelligence analysis. It was a presentation designed to convince the world that the invasion of Iraq was necessary and justified. Everything Powell presented that day was later determined to be false or without basis. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There was no active nuclear weapons program. There was no operational link between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. What the Bush administration presented as solid fact before Congress, the American public, and the international community simply did not exist. Without authorization from the United Nations Security Council, despite UN weapons inspectors already being inside Iraq and reporting that they had found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction, despite millions of people marching in the streets of dozens of countries in opposition to the war, the Bush administration ordered the invasion of Iraq on March 20, 2003, with a coalition it called the Coalition of the Willing, consisting primarily of Britain, Australia, and Poland alongside the United States, while major allies including France, Germany, and Russia refused to participate. The conventional combat phase moved quickly. American and coalition forces drove toward Baghdad within weeks. On April 9, 2003, the statue of Saddam Hussein in Baghdad's Firdos Square was pulled down before global television cameras. On May 1, 2003, Bush appeared on the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln in front of a large banner reading "Mission Accomplished" to declare that major combat operations had ended. It was one of the most illusory moments in the history of modern American politics. The mission was not accomplished. In fact, the worst and most costly phase of it had barely begun. After Saddam's government collapsed, the Bush administration had no adequately serious or detailed plan for what came next. Governing and stabilizing a country of 26 million people with a complex history, deeply conflicting religious and ethnic factions, and a state apparatus that had just been completely destroyed. The head of the American Civilian Provisional Authority in Iraq, L. Paul Bremer, made two decisions that many experts later described as the most catastrophically consequential strategic errors of the entire war. The first was the complete dissolution of the Iraqi army. This put approximately 400,000 trained, armed soldiers on the streets with no jobs and no income. Many of them subsequently joined the insurgency against the American occupation, bringing with them both military skills and knowledge of Iraq's weapons caches and security infrastructure. The second was the policy of de-Baathification,
the wholesale removal from all government and public positions of anyone associated with Saddam's Ba'ath Party. This sounded principled in theory, but in practice, the Ba'ath Party had been a prerequisite for public sector employment in Iraq for decades, meaning that most of the country's experienced teachers, doctors, engineers, and civil servants were removed from the system simultaneously. Iraq lost its administrative class precisely when it needed those people most. The result was an enormous power vacuum that countless armed factions rushed to fill. Sunni insurgents attacked American forces. Shia militias with ties to Iran began extending their influence. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, a new franchise that had not existed before the invasion, emerged and carried out devastating suicide bombings. Iraq slid into sectarian civil war, reaching its worst point in 2006 and 2007, when thousands of people were dying each month in violence between Sunni and Shia communities. In the period from 2003 to 2011, estimates of Iraqi civilian deaths from war-related violence range from 150,000 to more than 600,000, depending on the methodology used. More than 4,400 American soldiers were killed. Tens of thousands more were wounded, many carrying permanent disabilities. The financial cost of the war has been estimated at between $2 and $3 trillion, not counting long-term costs such as veterans' care. And the weapons of mass destruction, the official justification offered for all of it, were never found. But the story of Iraq is not only a story about strategic miscalculations leading to casualties and chaos. It is also a story about what happens when a democratic government abandons the values it claims to be defending while responding to a threat. Abu Ghraib Prison, a vast detention complex west of Baghdad, became the symbol of that abandonment. In 2004, leaked photographs showed Iraqi prisoners being tortured and abused by American soldiers in degrading and horrifying ways. Prisoners were forced into naked human pyramids. Prisoners were led on leashes like dogs. Prisoners were held in extreme stress positions for hours. American soldiers stood alongside these scenes smiling or posing for the camera. The photographs shocked the world and caused incalculable damage to America's reputation globally, particularly in the Muslim world. They demonstrated that the United States, the country claiming to bring freedom and dignity to Iraq, was treating its prisoners in ways that flagrantly violated the Geneva Conventions and the most fundamental principles of human rights. The Bush administration initially described what happened at Abu Ghraib as the actions of a few bad apples, individuals who had behaved wrongly and did not represent American policy. Several lower-ranking soldiers were prosecuted and convicted. But subsequent investigations, including the Taguba report conducted by Major General Antonio Taguba, concluded that what happened at Abu Ghraib was not the isolated behavior of a few individuals, but reflected a culture and environment created from the top down, in which the rules governing the treatment of prisoners had been deliberately blurred and oversight by the chain of command was critically deficient. Abu Ghraib was only the visible surface of a much deeper structure. Beneath it was a program approved at the highest levels of the Bush administration, in which the CIA was authorized to use interrogation techniques that the United States had previously classified as torture, when other countries used them on American prisoners. The most infamous of these techniques was waterboarding, in which the person being interrogated was strapped on their back with their face covered by cloth, then had water poured over it to produce the sensation of drowning. The technique was used on at least 3 senior al-Qaeda prisoners. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, accused of being the architect of September 11th, was waterboarded 183 times. Beyond waterboarding, the techniques included holding prisoners in stress positions for hours, keeping them awake continuously for days, confining them in spaces too small to stand upright, and using extreme temperatures. These methods were labeled with the euphemism enhanced interrogation techniques, a name deliberately designed to avoid calling them what they were. Authorization for these techniques came from the top.
Vice President Cheney was their most enthusiastic champion. The Justice Department under Attorney General John Ashcroft and Deputy Attorney General John Yoo produced a series of legal memoranda, later known as the torture memos, offering narrow and contorted legal arguments to classify these methods as something other than torture under American law. The Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation report of 2014, a document of more than 6,000 pages, whose public version was reduced to just over 500 pages, concluded that the CIA's interrogation techniques were more brutal than what had been disclosed to Congress, that the CIA had misled Congress and the White House about the program's scope and effectiveness, and, most critically, that the program was not as effective as claimed in producing actionable intelligence. In other words, America had tortured people, and it was not only morally wrong, but not particularly effective in practice. Running alongside the CIA interrogation program was a network of secret detention facilities, known as black sites, located in various countries around the world, where the CIA held and interrogated suspects without legal oversight, without charges, and without access to lawyers. There was also the detention camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where hundreds of people were held under conditions deliberately designed to fall outside the jurisdiction of American law and international conventions. The Bush administration argued that those detained at Guantanamo were unlawful enemy combatants, not entitled to the protections of the Geneva Conventions applicable to prisoners of war. Dozens of people were held at Guantanamo for years without trial, without charges, and in many cases without genuine evidence establishing them as threats. Review hearings examining the basis for detention were conducted without adherence to the most basic legal standards. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled multiple times that Guantanamo detainees had the right to access federal courts, rulings that the Bush administration met with visible frustration and attempted to limit in practical effect. Shortly after September 11th, Congress passed and Bush signed the Patriot Act, a law that significantly expanded government authority to monitor, collect intelligence on, and investigate terrorism suspects. Many of its provisions generated fierce debate about the balance between national security and civil liberties. But even more controversial than the Patriot Act itself was what the National Security Agency was doing without Congress or the public knowing. Bush had signed a secret executive order authorizing the NSA to conduct warrantless wiretapping and surveillance of Americans' electronic communications, in violation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, which required a court order for such activities. This program came to public attention only in 2005 through a New York Times investigation, and then, in far greater breadth, through Edward Snowden's 2013 disclosures about the true scale of the electronic surveillance the NSA was conducting, not only against foreigners, but against American citizens and the leaders of allied nations. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall on America's Gulf Coast, and what followed became the defining symbol of the federal government's failure to protect its own citizens in the most basic and direct sense. New Orleans, a below-sea-level city protected by a levee system, was inundated when those levees failed. Tens of thousands of people, primarily black and poor residents without the means or ability to evacuate, were stranded in the flooded city. They took shelter in the Superdome and the Ernest N. Morial Convention Center under conditions that deteriorated sharply while they waited for government assistance. That assistance came with agonizing slowness and humiliating inadequacy. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, under Director Michael Brown, appointed to his position on the basis of political connections rather than emergency management experience, demonstrated a level of disorganization and inaction that defied defense. Coordination among federal, state, and local agencies failed systematically. Bush, vacationing at his ranch in Texas, initially continued with his travel plans, rather than returning to Washington to manage the crisis. When he finally flew over the disaster zone on Air Force One, a photograph taken of him gazing down from a window became an enduring image of a White House disconnected from the reality of the people dying below. More than 1,800 people died in the storm and the flooding that followed. The majority were black and poor. Many died not from the hurricane itself, but from the delays in rescue after the storm had passed. The images of Americans dying on rooftops waiting for helicopters that did not come, of a person dead in a wheelchair in front of the Superdome, of thousands gathered without food, water, or basic sanitation for days, were permanently burned into America's collective memory as evidence of a system that had failed the people it was built to protect. The most famous remark Bush made about the federal response to Katrina, telling FEMA Director Brown at the height of the crisis, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job," became the defining phrase of an administration that was seeing the world through a lens entirely different from the one inhabited by the people living in it. George W. Bush left the White House in January 2009 with approval ratings of approximately 22 to 34%, depending on the poll, among the lowest of any departing president in American history. Both wars he had started were still ongoing. The American economy was in the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s, partly the consequence of the deregulatory approach of his administration. America's standing in the world was at its lowest point in decades. Bush's defenders argue that he protected America from further terrorist attacks after September 11th, that the difficult decisions he made about interrogation and surveillance saved American lives, and that removing Saddam Hussein, however flawed the justification, eliminated a brutal dictator. Some of those arguments contain a measure of truth, but they are not sufficient to balance the enormous cost paid by the people of Iraq, by American soldiers, and ultimately by the entire Middle East region. The consequences of the Iraq War did not end when American forces withdrew. The chaos the invasion created provided the conditions for the rise of the Islamic State, ISIS, an organization more brutal and geographically expansive than Al-Qaeda, which controlled large swaths of Iraq and Syria by 2014 and carried out massacres and terrorist attacks across the globe. ISIS could not have come into existence without the power vacuum that the 2003 invasion of Iraq created. George W. Bush was not wicked by nature. He was a man who genuinely believed he was doing the right thing, that he was protecting America and bringing freedom to the people of Iraq. That sincere belief did not make his decisions any less destructive. It only made them an example of a particular kind of failure, the kind that occurs when a person with enormous power acts on conviction without examining it rigorously enough, when confidence is mistaken for vision, and when determination is mistaken for wisdom. Hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions displaced, a region transformed in ways whose damage continues spreading to this day. That is the legacy of decisions made in conference rooms in Washington, D.C., by people who were absolutely certain they knew what they were doing. And the most frightening thing about George W. Bush is not that he was cruel or malicious. The most frightening thing is that he was ordinary. And the most ordinary things can sometimes lead to the most extraordinary consequences in the worst possible direction, when they are placed under the pressure of national fear and empowered by the highest position of authority on earth. Chapter 10. Donald Trump, the 45th and 47th President, the man who broke what America thought could not be broken. There are figures in history about whom, when you try to write objectively, you realize that reality itself is shocking enough that no embellishment is needed. Donald Trump is one of them. He is the only president in American history to be impeached twice. He is the only president to refuse a peaceful transfer of power after losing an election. He is the first former president to be convicted of a crime. He is the only person ever found liable for sexual misconduct against a woman in a civil verdict while actively campaigning for the presidency a second time. And he is the man who came back to win the 2024 election and become president for a second non-consecutive term, something that had not happened in American history since Grover Cleveland more than a century earlier. The story of Donald Trump is a story about rupture. The rupture of norms, the rupture of institutions, the rupture of limits that people assumed could not be crossed in a modern democracy. And to understand how that happened and what its consequences are, we have to begin at the beginning.
Donald John Trump was born on June 14, 1946, in Queens, New York, the son of Fred Trump, a wealthy New York real estate developer who specialized in building and managing affordable apartment complexes in the outer boroughs of Manhattan. Unlike the image Trump later constructed of himself as a self-made man, reporting by journalists and a 2018 New York Times investigation found that Trump received at least $413 million from his father's empire in today's dollar values, through various means, including loans, gifts, and property transactions that tax experts described as legally questionable. Trump attended the New York Military Academy in his teenage years, then transferred to Fordham University before graduating from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in economics. He joined his father's real estate company and rapidly expanded into ventures of his own, including luxury office towers and condominiums in Manhattan, hotels, and casinos. Trump's business career was a complex mixture of genuine successes and well-documented failures. He built the Trump brand into a name recognized worldwide and associated with luxury and exclusivity. But he also went through 6 corporate bankruptcies, primarily involving Atlantic City casinos that cost creditors and investors hundreds of millions of dollars, while he himself escaped through bankruptcy proceedings. His critics pointed to a pattern repeating across decades. He made money, while those who did business with him lost it. From 2004 to 2015, Trump hosted the reality television program The Apprentice on NBC, a show in which he played the role of a powerful executive sitting at the head of a boardroom table and telling contestants, "You're fired." The program was watched by tens of millions of Americans every week for years, and it created in the public mind an image of Trump as a successful, decisive, and uncompromising businessman. Though people who actually knew the business world understood that image did not entirely match the reality. The combination of a luxury real estate brand and reality television celebrity created an unlikely foundation for a political career that, before 2015, virtually everyone in Washington considered impossible to take seriously. On June 16, 2015, Donald Trump descended a gold-plated escalator in Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan to announce his presidential candidacy. The speech immediately became controversial because in its opening minutes, Trump described immigrants from Mexico in terms that many people regarded as racist and dehumanizing, declaring that Mexico was sending people that have lots of problems, drug dealers, criminals, and rapists, adding that some, I assume, are good people. The initial reaction from the media and political establishments was to treat him as a spectacle, a famous personality who could not possibly be taken seriously as a presidential contender. They were wrong. Trump employed a campaign strategy unlike anything any presidential candidate had used before. He did not need the traditional fundraising network because his brand was already famous enough. He did not need the traditional organizational infrastructure because social media, particularly Twitter, allowed him to reach tens of millions of people directly, bypassing the filters of traditional journalism. He was not constrained by the norms of what a candidate could say, because he was willing to say anything and let the consequences sort themselves out. He attacked Republican primary opponents with contemptuous nicknames: Lion Ted for Ted Cruz, Little Marco for Marco Rubio, Low Energy Jeb for Jeb Bush. He raised questions about Ted Cruz's eligibility for the presidency by suggesting that Cruz's birth in Canada might disqualify him. He mocked a disabled reporter at a rally by mimicking his movements. He attacked former prisoner of war John McCain by saying he preferred people who weren't captured. In any previous election cycle, any single one of these moments would have been sufficient to end the candidacy. With Trump, they only made him more famous.
He won the Republican nomination after defeating 16 opponents in the largest primary field in the party's history. Then, in the general election, he defeated Hillary Clinton, whom most experts and media figures had been confident would win easily, by an electoral college margin of 306 to 232, despite losing the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes. America and the world woke up on the morning of November 9, 2016, to a new reality that most of them had not prepared for. Even before Trump took office, serious questions had already emerged about whether his campaign had any connection to the Russian government. The American intelligence community, comprising the CIA, FBI, and NSA, concluded in January 2017 with high confidence that Russia had intervened in the 2016 election with the intent of helping Trump win, through cyber attacks on Democratic Party institutions, leaking stolen emails through WikiLeaks, and social media campaigns designed to amplify divisions within American society. Special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation ran for nearly 2 years and concluded in 2019 with a 448-page report. The report confirmed that Russia had intervened in the election in ways that were systematic and sweeping. It documented dozens of contacts between the Trump campaign and Russian officials or intermediaries. But it did not conclude that the Trump campaign and Russia had conspired or coordinated in a manner sufficient to support criminal charges. What the Mueller report did establish clearly, which the Trump administration attempted to describe as complete exoneration, was that the investigation had identified 10 instances in which Trump may have obstructed justice, but Mueller decided not to render judgment on that question because Justice Department guidelines held that a sitting president could not be criminally indicted. Mueller made clear in subsequent congressional testimony that his report did not exonerate Trump of obstruction of justice. Many of Trump's associates were indicted and convicted during the Mueller investigation, including campaign manager Paul Manafort, First National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, personal attorney Michael Cohen, and others. A total of 34 people indicted and 8 convicted or pleading guilty. Trump's first term, from January 2017 to January 2021, was 4 years during which American media continuously struggled to find language to describe what was happening, because what was happening had no precedent in modern history. The rate of personnel turnover in the Trump administration was without parallel. Over 4 years, Trump had 4 White House chiefs of staff, 4 national security advisors, 2 attorneys general, 2 secretaries of defense, 2 secretaries of state, 2 CIA directors, and repeated replacements across dozens of other senior positions. Many departed in public acrimony, some writing books or issuing public statements describing Trump as unfit, dangerous, or both. Secretary of Defense James Mattis resigned in December 2018 after Trump decided to withdraw troops from Syria abruptly without consulting allies or military advisors. In his resignation letter, Mattis wrote that Trump deserved a Secretary of Defense whose views were more aligned with his own, and Mattis was not that person because he held fundamentally different views about treating allies and disagreed with Trump's characterization of America's adversaries. It was one of the most pointed and alarming resignation letters ever written by a senior military official about a president. FBI Director James Comey was fired by Trump in May 2017, and in interviews afterward, Trump acknowledged to NBC's Lester Holt that he had been thinking about the Russia thing when he made the decision to fire Comey, an admission that legal observers immediately identified as potential evidence of obstruction of justice. Trump's approach to immigration and the border generated one of the largest humanitarian controversies in modern American history. In 2018, the administration implemented a zero-tolerance policy at the southern border, under which all adults crossing illegally were criminally prosecuted. And because children could not be held with adults in criminal detention facilities, the policy had the practical effect of separating children from their parents when families were apprehended. More than 2,500 children were separated from their families before the policy was revoked following a wave of public outrage. Dozens of children remained unreunited with their families years afterward, because the tracking systems had been inadequate. The 2017 tax legislation, described as a tax cut for the middle class, in practice delivered its largest and most lasting benefits to corporations and the wealthiest Americans, while the cuts for lower and middle-income individuals were designed to expire over time. The Congressional Budget Office estimated the law would add approximately $1.9 trillion to the federal deficit over a decade. Trump's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic is an area where his critics argue the consequences can be measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. As the virus began spreading from China in early 2020, Trump repeatedly and publicly minimized its severity, comparing it to the seasonal flu and predicting it would disappear like a miracle when the weather warmed. He attacked public health officials when they recommended social distancing measures and masks. He publicly promoted unproven treatments, including hydroxychloroquine, and in one extraordinary moment, suggested exploring whether injecting disinfectant into the body might kill the virus. The United States, with roughly 4% of the world's population, accounted for nearly 20% of global COVID-19 deaths during the early phases of the pandemic. Studies later indicated that if America had achieved death rates comparable to other wealthy nations that implemented stronger public health measures, hundreds of thousands of lives might have been saved. In September 2019, a whistleblower inside the intelligence community filed a complaint alleging that Trump had behaved improperly in a phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in July 2019. The rough transcript of that call, released by the White House itself, showed Trump asking Zelensky to announce an investigation into Hunter Biden, the son of former Vice President Joe Biden, who was Trump's leading opponent in the 2020 election. The call came shortly after the administration had placed a hold on $391 million in congressionally approved military aid to Ukraine. The House opened an impeachment inquiry and in December 2019 voted to impeach Trump on two articles: abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Trump became the third president in American history to be impeached by the House. The Senate trial took place in January and February 2020 and ended with Republican senators voting nearly unanimously to acquit, though Senator Mitt Romney of Utah became the first senator in American history to vote to convict a president of his own party on one of the articles. In November 2020, Trump lost the presidential election to Joe Biden with an electoral college result of 306 to 232, an exact reversal of the 2016 outcome, and a popular vote loss of more than 7 million votes. This was an election that election officials from both parties, state and federal courts across the country, and Trump's own Attorney General William Barr all confirmed was among the most secure in American history. Trump refused to accept the result. On election night itself, before vote counting was complete, Trump appeared before reporters to declare that he had won and to allege fraud. In the weeks and months that followed, Trump and his legal team filed more than 60 lawsuits in state and federal courts challenging the results in battleground states. All but one, involving a minor technical matter that did not affect the overall outcome, were dismissed for lack of evidence. Many were dismissed by judges Trump himself had appointed. No evidence of electoral fraud sufficient to change the outcome in any state was found. This was not the opinion of Democrats. It was the conclusion of law enforcement agencies, election officials, courts, and bipartisan investigative committees following months of rigorous examination. But Trump continued alleging fraud, and tens of millions of his supporters believed the allegations. Polling in the months that followed showed a majority of Republican voters believed the election had been stolen, a belief unsupported by evidence but amplified and maintained by conservative media and by Trump himself through hundreds of social media posts. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, subsequent investigations revealed that even Trump's closest advisors, including Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and personal attorney Rudy Giuliani, knew that the specific fraud allegations being promoted were without foundation. Internal conversations documented in numerous congressional investigations showed a startling gap between what they said publicly and what they discussed privately. When every legal effort failed, Trump and his allies turned to a final strategy, preventing Congress from formally certifying the election results on January 6, 2021, the date designated by the Constitution for Congress to count and confirm the Electoral College votes. In the weeks before January 6th, Trump and his allies pressured Vice President Mike Pence, who under the Constitution had the role of presiding over the certification session, to unilaterally refuse to certify the votes from certain states or return them to the states for reconsideration. Constitutional lawyers from both parties agreed that Pence had no constitutional authority to take either action, and Pence ultimately refused to comply with Trump's demands. On the morning of January 6, 2021, Trump spoke for over an hour to a crowd of tens of thousands gathered near the White House. He repeated his unsubstantiated fraud allegations, attacked Pence for failing to act as he demanded, and told the crowd that they needed to fight like hell because if they didn't, they would not have a country anymore. He told them they would march down to the Capitol together. He did not march with them. He returned to the White House to watch television. The crowd, many of them members of armed extremist groups, including the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, surged toward the Capitol. At approximately 2:12 p.m., they breached the security barriers and stormed the building, while senators and representatives were in session just inside. What happened over the hours that followed were scenes that many Americans never thought they would witness in their lifetimes. Rioters smashed windows, broke through doors, and flooded through hallways carrying Trump flags and Confederate flags, ransacked congressional offices, sat in the chair of the Senate president, and carried zip ties and handcuffs that subsequent investigations found at least some of them intended to use to detain officials. Some were armed, some wore tactical gear. Some displayed white supremacist symbols. 4 people died during and immediately after the assault, including Ashley Babbitt, a Trump supporter shot by police as she attempted to climb through a broken window leading into the area just outside the House chamber where members were being evacuated. 5 police officers died in the days and weeks afterward from causes connected to the assault. More than 140 officers were injured while attempting to defend the building. The Capitol was occupied for several hours. Vice President Pence was evacuated urgently as the crowd chanted, "Hang Mike Pence." The National Guard was eventually deployed to retake the building, but only after a delay of hours that investigators later found deeply suspicious. During the hours when the violence was unfolding, Trump initially refused to condemn what was happening. According to multiple accounts from people inside the White House at the time, he was watching live television coverage of the events and was described for a period as watching with pleasure. When he finally posted a video asking the rioters to leave, he called them very special and told them, "We love you." 1 week after January 6th, the House voted to impeach Trump for the second time, this time on the charge of incitement of insurrection. Notably, 10 Republican members voted alongside the entire Democratic caucus to pass the impeachment, the highest bipartisan vote ever recorded in the history of presidential impeachment in America. The Senate trial, conducted after Trump had already left office, ended with 57 votes for conviction and 43 against, meaning a majority of senators voted to convict, but the 2/3 threshold required for conviction and a ban on future office holding was not reached. Once again, this was the highest number of votes to convict from the president's own party in history, with 7 Republican senators voting guilty. The House Select Committee investigating January 6th, after hundreds of interviews and thousands of documents, concluded that Trump was the direct cause of the January 6th attack and had violated his constitutional duty by refusing to act to stop the violence once it began. The committee referred the matter to the Justice Department, with recommendations that Trump be prosecuted on 4 counts related to his efforts to overturn the election results. While many former presidents leave office and gradually fade from the political stage, Trump's legal journey was only beginning. In March 2023, The Manhattan District Attorney's Office indicted Trump on 34 counts of falsifying business records related to the concealment of a $130,000 payment made to adult film actress Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election in exchange for her silence about a sexual encounter that Trump denied, but Daniels said had occurred. It was the first time in American history that a former president had been criminally indicted. In May 2024, a Manhattan jury, after 6 weeks of trial, returned its verdict, guilty on all 34 counts. Donald Trump became the first former president and the first sitting or former president in American history to be convicted of a crime. Beyond the Manhattan case, Trump faced 3 additional criminal indictments. Federal prosecutors charged him with retaining classified documents after leaving office at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida and obstructing efforts to recover them. Federal prosecutors also charged him with conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election results, and a Georgia state prosecutor charged him and 18 co-defendants with racketeering and conspiracy to overturn the Georgia election results. The federal cases were subsequently stayed or dismissed after the Supreme Court ruled that presidents possess immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts taken while in office, a decision of profound constitutional significance that legal scholars debated as fundamentally altering the understood limits of presidential power. Despite facing all of this, despite a criminal conviction and 4 indictments, Trump did not merely remain in the race. He won the 2024 presidential election against Vice President Kamala Harris, who had been nominated by the Democrats after President Biden withdrew from the race in July 2024. Trump won with an electoral college result of 312 to 226, and also won the national popular vote, the first Republican candidate to win the popular vote since George W. Bush in 2004. He became the 47th president and the second non-consecutive president in American history, after Grover Cleveland, who had served as both the 22nd and the 24th. Trump's second term began in January 2025 in a deeply divided America. From his first day, he signed waves of executive orders implementing his campaign promises, including large-scale immigration measures, tariffs against numerous countries, and the reversal of many Biden administration policies. The debate about those policies and their long-term consequences is still unfolding as you watch this video. What can be said with confidence is that Trump's second term continues the pattern of the first: rapid change, deep controversy, and a reshaping not only of policy, but of what is considered possible and acceptable in American politics. Donald Trump left his first term having demonstrated things that cannot be erased from history. He showed that the democratic norms the people assumed were protected by long-established convention and custom were in fact protected only by the willingness of those with power to honor them. He showed that a president could refuse a peaceful transfer of power and not be punished politically severely enough to end his career. He showed that a major political party could support false claims about a thoroughly verified election without losing enough support to face serious electoral consequences. He showed that a person could be convicted of a crime and still be elected president. Trump's supporters would argue he demonstrated something different, that an outsider could challenge and overcome the barriers that the establishment had built to protect its own interests, that the tens of millions of Americans who felt forgotten by traditional politics found in him a voice and an advocate, however imperfect. That is a perspective deserving of understanding, even if not agreement. But what both sides must acknowledge is that America after Trump is different from America before Trump, in ways that cannot be fully reversed. The question that history will have to answer, the question that those living through this period cannot yet fully answer, is where those changes lead, whether the institutions of American democracy are strong enough to absorb and recover from what has happened, or whether we are in the early stages of a far deeper transformation, whose true consequences will only become clear in the decades ahead. One thing is certain: the story of Donald Trump is not finished, and history, the ultimate judge of all of this, is still in the process of writing its verdict.